The year was 1848. The Mexican-American War had just concluded, and the territory of California, a vast, rugged landscape of mission towns and ranches, had passed into American hands. At the time, few realized that the ground beneath their feet held a secret that would alter the course of human history. Among the early arrivals was J. Tyrwhitt Brooks, a physician who came seeking a quiet life but found himself at the epicenter of the greatest gold rush the world would ever see. This is the story of that expedition, a journey from the foggy cliffs of San Francisco to the lawless camps of the Sierra Nevada. The fog of the Pacific was finally breaking. After a grueling voyage that had left the passengers battered and exhausted, the jagged silhouettes of the Farallon Islands emerged from the mist, sentinels guarding the gateway to a new world. This was the entrance to San Francisco Bay, a strategic bottleneck a mile wide, flanked by bold, broken hills. On the right, crumbling Spanish fortifications stood as relics of a dying empire, overshadowed now by the stars and stripes snapping in the wind. As the ship glided into the broad, rippling sheet of the inland lake, the violent pitching ceased. Green hills rose on all sides, dotted with innumerable grazing herds, a pastoral calm that belied the chaos about to erupt. He had suffered so much from the voyage that when the anchor was let go, Brooks felt no inclination to hurry on shore. MacPhail and Malcolm, however, went off but promised to return to the ship that night. He soon after turned into his hammock and, thanks to the stillness of the water in which the group rode, slept soundly till morning. On the morning of April 29th, the group all rose early and went on shore. The little baggage they had the group took in the boat. Malcolm told him that he had heard the war was over between the United States and Mexico, and he bitterly congratulated himself on experiencing his usual run of misfortune. They made their way to Sweeting's Hotel, which Malcolm and MacPhail had visited the previous day, and stated to be the best of the 3 hotels which have sprung up there since the Americans became masters of the place. Malcolm intends making an excursion to the interior. He proposes to visit the American settlements and to satisfy himself as to the reputed advantages which California presents as an agricultural country. He had agreed to accompany him. The group have fallen in with 2 very pleasant American gentlemen at their hotel that day. One, a Captain Folsom, holding some appointment under government there. The other, a young friend of his named Bradley. They had some conversation together on the subject of the Mexican War, in the course of which he learned that Mr. Bradley has been a resident in California for the last 8 years, and that he was one of the officers of the Volunteer Corps attached to the Army of the United States, while military operations were going on in this country. He told him of his desire to enter as a surgeon in the service of the States, and he promised to speak to Captain Folsom on the subject, and obtain from him a letter to Colonel Mason, the new governor. But he is afraid there is little chance of his meeting with success, as nearly all the volunteer corps have been, or are about to be, disbanded. Both Mr. Bradley and Captain Folsom speak very favorably of the climate and soil of California, and say that an enterprising agriculturist is sure to make a speedy fortune. Bradley, who has agreed to accompany us on their trip, strongly advises Malcolm to shift his quarters from Oregon and settle there, saying that he is sure his companion will do so when he has once seen the farms in the Sacramento Valley, whither the group are to start early next week. MacPhail left us that day to make a trip to Sonoma. San Francisco, although as yet but a poor place, will no doubt become a great emporium of commerce. The population may be about a couple of thousands. Of these, 2/3 are Americans. The houses, with the exception of some few wooden ones which have been shipped over there by the Americans, are nearly all built of unburnt bricks. The appearance of the native Californian is quite Spanish. The men wear high steeple-like hats, jackets of gaudy colors, and breeches of velvet, generally cotton. They are a handsome, swarthy race. The best part in the faces of the women are their eyes, which are black and very lustrous. The Californian belles, he was sorry to say, spoil their teeth by smoking cigarettes. By May 4th, the party had reached Monterey, started off early on the morning of the 2nd on their journey to Monterey. They discovered their horses in readiness in the hotel yard, in charge of a servant. They're called a vaquero of Mr. Bradley's. The latter, having business to transact at Monterey, accompanied us. His horse was equipped after the Spanish fashion, with the usual high-pommeled cumbrous saddle, with a great show of useless trappings and clumsy wooden stirrups, and for a long time he found the riding sufficiently disagreeable, though doubtless far more pleasant than a coast journey would have been, with a repetition of the deadly seasickness from which he had already suffered so much. He soon found out, too, the advantages of the Spanish saddle, as enabling one to keep one's seat when traveling over thorough broken country through which their road ran. Bradley had told us to have their rifles in readiness, as no one travels any distance there without that very necessary protection, the mountains near the coast being infested with lawless gangs of ruffians who lie in wait for solitary travelers. The first part of their ride lay through a dense thicket of underwood, and afterwards across parched-up valleys and over low sandy hills, then past large grazing grounds, where cattle might be counted by the thousand, and numerous ranchos or farms, the white farm buildings surrounded by little garden patches scattered over the hillsides. The group at length came to an extensive plain, with groups of oaks spread over its surface, and soon afterwards reached the neglected mission of Santa Clara, where the group halted for a few hours. On leaving there, their road was over a raised causeway some 2 or 3 miles in length, beneath an avenue of shady trees, which extended as far as the outskirts of the town of St. This town, or pueblo as it was called, is nothing more than a mass of ill-arranged and ill-built houses, with an ugly church and a broad plaza, peopled by 300 or 400 inhabitants. Not being used to long journeys on horseback, Brooks felt disposed to stop there for the night, but Bradley urged us to proceed a few miles farther, where the group could take up their quarters at a rancho belonging to a friend of his. Accordingly, the group pushed on, and after a ride of about 7 miles, diverged from the main road and soon reached the farmhouse, where the group were well entertained and had a good night's rest. Like the generality of houses in California, this was only 1 story high and was built of piles driven into the ground, interlaced with boughs and sticks, and then plastered over with mud and whitewashed. The better class of farmhouses are built of adobes or unburnt bricks and tiled over. The interior was as plain and cheerless as it well could be. The floor was formed of the soil, beaten down till it was as firm and hard as a piece of stone. The room set apart for their sleeping accommodation boasted as its sole ornaments a Dutch clock and a few gaudily colored prints of saints hung round the walls. The beds were not over-comfortable, but the group were too tired to be nice. In the morning he took a survey of the exterior and saw but few cattle stalled in the sheds around the house. The greater part, its sterns, after being branded, are suffered to run loose over the neighboring pastures. There was a well-cultivated garden in the rear of the house, with abundance of fruit trees and vegetables. While the group were at breakfast, Malcolm asked their host several questions about his crops, and soon found that he was no practical agriculturist. He had, however, at Bradley's suggestion, discarded the native wooden plow for the more effective American implement. He told us that he calculated his crop of wheat this year would yield 100 fangas for every one sown, and on their expressing their surprise at such a bountiful return, said that 60 or over was the usual average. If so, the soil must be somewhat wonderful. After expressing their thanks for the hospitality shown us to the wife of their host, who was a very pretty little dark-eyed woman, with a most winning way about her, the group started off to resume their journey. For his own part, Brooks felt very loth to proceed, for Brooks was terribly fatigued by his performance of the previous day, and suffered not a little from that disagreeable malady called saddle sickness. Their Californian accompanied us some short distance on their road, which lay for many miles through a wide valley, watered by a considerable stream, and overgrown with oaks and sycamores. Low hills rose on either hand, covered with dark ridges of lofty pine trees, up which herds of elk and deer were every now and then seen scampering. The group at length entered upon a narrow road through a range of green sheltering hills, and passing the mission of San Juan, crossed a wide plain and ascended the mountain ridge which lay between us and Monterey, where the group arrived late in the day. Next morning, Mr. Bradley accompanied him to the governor's house, where they witnessed Colonel Mason, the new governor of the state. He received us with great politeness, but said that the war, if war it deserved to be called, was now at an end, that but a small number of troops were stationed in the country, and that there was no vacancy for a surgeon. Indeed, he said, considering that the group have given up head-breaking and the climate is proverbially healthy, California is hardly the place for doctors to settle in. Besides, said he, the native Californians all use the temescal, a sort of air bath, as a remedy for every disorder. Colonel Mason then asked Mr. Bradley if he had heard the reports of gold having been found on the Sacramento, as Mr. Folsom had casually mentioned in a letter to him that such rumors were prevalent at San Francisco. Bradley replied that he had heard something about it, but believed that there was no truth in the matter, although a few fools had indeed rushed off to the reputed gold mines forthwith. With this, their interview terminated. Monterey seems to be a rising town. The American style of houses is superseding the old mud structures, and numbers of new buildings are being run up every month. The hotel the group stopped at has only been recently opened by an American. Monterey is moreover a port of some importance, if one may judge from the number of vessels lying at anchor. May 7th. On Friday, the group dined at the house of Don Luis Palo, a Californian gentleman of agreeable manners, whose father held office there under the Spanish government previous to the Mexican Revolution. He believed it was Don Luis's intention shortly to return to Spain. He is unmarried, and his two sisters are the handsomest women he had yet seen in this country. Their beauty is quite of the Spanish style. A dinner in California seems to be always the same: first soup and then beef, dressed in various ways and seasoned with chilies, fowls, rice, and beans, with a full allowance of pepper and garlic to each dish. On Saturday, the group set out on their return, and after 2 days' hard riding reached San Francisco that day at 4 p.m. American Fork, about 100 miles in the interior, where he had been gold washing. Captain Folsom saw the gold he had with him. It was about 23 ounces weight and in small flakes. The man stated that he was 8 days getting it, but Captain Folsom hardly believed this. He says that he saw some of this gold a few weeks since and thought it was only mica, but good judges have pronounced it to be genuine metal. He talks, however, of paying a visit to the place where it was reported to come from. After he was gone, Bradley stated that the Sacramento settlements which Malcolm wished to visit were in the neighborhood of the American Fork, and that the group might go there together. He thought the distance was only 120 miles. May 10th. The previous day and that day nothing has been talked of but the new gold placer, as people call it. It seems that 4 other men had accompanied the person Captain Folsom saw the previous day, and that they had each realized a large quantity of gold. They left the diggings on the American Fork, which it seems is the Rio de los Americanos, a tributary to the Sacramento, about a week ago, and stopped a day or two at Sutter's Fort, a few miles this side of the diggings, on their way. From there, they had traveled by boat to San Francisco. The gold they brought has been examined by the first alcalde there and by all the merchants in the place. Bradley showed us a lump weighing 1/4 of an ounce, which he had bought of one of the men, and for which he gave him $3.50. He had no doubt in his own mind about its being genuine gold. Several parties, the group here, are already made up to visit the diggings, and according to the newspaper there, a number of people have actually started off with shovels, mattocks, and pans to dig the gold themselves. It was not likely, however, that this will be allowed, for Captain Folsom has already written to Colonel Mason about taking possession of the mine on behalf of the government, it being, as he says, on public land. May 13. It was now finally settled that the group start off on Wednesday to the Sacramento Valley. That day, under Bradley's direction, he had bought a good horse, for which he paid only $15. It will be very little more expense than hiring a horse of the hotel master there, besides being far more agreeable to have a horse of one's own. For everybody, the commonest workman even, rides in this country. The gold excitement increases daily, as several fresh arrivals from the mines have been reported at San Francisco. The merchants eagerly buy up the gold brought by the miners, and no doubt, in many cases, at prices considerably under its value. He had heard, though, of as much as $16 an ounce having been given in some instances, which he should have thought was over rather than under the full value of gold in the United States. He confessed he began to feel seriously affected with the prevailing excitement, and am anxious for Wednesday to arrive, May 17th. This place is now in a perfect furor of excitement. All the work people have struck. Walking through the town that day, he observed that laborers were employed only upon about half a dozen of the 50 new buildings which were in course of being run up. The majority of the mechanics at this place are making preparations for moving off to the mines, and several hundred people of all classes, lawyers, storekeepers, merchants, etc., are bitten with the fever. In fact, there is a regular gold mania springing up. He counted no less than 18 houses which were closed, the owners having left. If Colonel Mason is moving a force to the American Fork, as is reported there, their journey will be in vain. Their trip has been delayed that day, for the saddler cannot get their equipments in readiness for at least 48 hours. He says that directly he has finished the job he shall start off himself to the diggings. He had bribed him with promises of greatly increased pay not to disappoint us again. As it was, the group were to pay him a very high price, which he demanded on account of 3 of his men having left him, and there being only himself and 2 workmen to attend to their order. I told Mr. Bradley of their misfortune. He promised to wait for us, but recommended him to keep going in and out of the saddlers all day long, in order to make sure that the man was at work. Otherwise, the group might be kept hanging about for a fortnight. May 20th. It requires a full amount of patience to stay quietly watching the proceedings of an inattentive tradesman amid such a whirlpool of excitement as is now in action. Sweeting tells him that his Negro waiter has demanded and receives $10 a day. He is forced to submit, for helps of all kinds are in great demand and very difficult to meet with. Several hundred people must have left there during the last few days. Malcolm and he had their baggage all in readiness to start on Monday. May 22nd. That day all their arrangements have been changed. The saddler did not keep his promise, and while Malcolm, Bradley, and himself were venting their indignation against him, Don Luis Paulo made his appearance. The gold fever had spread to Monterey, and he had determined to be off to the mines at once. He had brought his servant, a converted Indian, named Jose, with him, and extra horses with his baggage. He intended to set to work himself at the diggings and meant to take everything he required with him. He says the report about Colonel Mason's moving a force off to the mines to take possession of them is all nonsense. That some of the garrison of Monterey have already gone there is quite true, but they have deserted to dig sold on their own account. Colonel Mason, he says, knows too well that he has no efficient force for such a purpose, and that even if he had, he would not be able to keep his men together. It appears also that the mines occupy several miles of ground, the gold not being confined to one particular spot. On hearing this intelligence, the group at once determined to follow Don Luis's example, and although there seemed a certain degree of absurdity in 4 people, all holding some position in society, going off on what might turn out to be only a fool's errand, still the evidence they had before us, of the gold which had actually been found, and the example of the multitudes who were daily hastening to the diggings, determined us to go with the rest. The group therefore held a council upon the best method of proceeding, at which everyone offered his suggestions. While the group were thus engaged, McPhail, their fellow passenger from Oregon, made his appearance, having only just then returned from Sonoma. He had heard a great deal about the new gold placer, and he had merely come back for his baggage, intending to start off for the mines forthwith. The result of their deliberations was to this effect. Each man was to furnish himself with one good horse for his own use, and a second horse to carry his personal baggage, as well as a portion of the general outfit. The group were each to take a rifle, holster pistols, etc. It was agreed, moreover, that a tent should be bought immediately, if such a thing could be procured, as well as some spades and mattocks and a good stout axe, together with a collection of blankets and hides, and a supply of coffee, sugar, whiskey, and brandy, knives, forks, and plates with pots and kettles, and all the requisite cooking utensils for a camp life. The tent is the great difficulty, and fears are entertained that the group shall not be able to procure one, but Bradley thinks he might buy one out of the government stores. He followed the saddler well up during the day and was fortunate enough to obtain their saddles, saddlebags, etc. by 4 o'clock. On going to his house a couple of hours after about some trifling alteration he wished made, he found it shut up and deserted. On the door was pasted a paper with the following words: "Gone to the diggings, Sonoma, May 24th. That morning at last saw us off." The group left San Francisco shortly after 7 and embarked with their horses and baggage in a launch, which landed us at Sausalito before 10. From thence they made their way to Sonoma, where the group put up for the night. The group formed quite a cavalcade and presented a tolerably imposing appearance. First came the horses, 6 in number, which carried their baggage, camp equipments, etc. After these came Jose, Don Luis's Indian servant, who seems to be a far more lively fellow than Indians are generally, having these extra horses in his charge, and he really managed them admirably. For what with whistling and coaxing and swearing and swinging his riata over their heads, he had them as much under his command as ever a crack dragsman had his four in hand in the good old coaching times of his own dear England. The group followed after, riding, when the road would admit of it, all abreast, and presenting a bold front to any gang of desperadoes who might be daring enough to attack us. There was little fear of this, however, for the group hardly rode a mile without falling in with scattered parties bound to the gold mines. They made their way but slowly during the first portion of their ride, for the road wound up steep hills and down into deep hollows. But when at last the group came upon a winding valley some miles in extent, their horses got over the ground in a style which only Californian steeds could achieve after the hard work which had already been performed. Towards evening, the group crossed the hills which divided the valley from Sonoma Plain, and on reaching Sonoma put up at an hotel recently opened there by a citizen from the United States, who coolly told us, in the course of conversation, that he guessed he didn't intend shearing off to the gold mines until he had drawn a few $1,000s from the San Francisco folk who passed through there to and from the diggings. May 27th, the group stopped at Sonoma the greater part of Thursday to give their horses rest. At the hotel, he met Lieutenant Sherman, who had brought dispatches to the officer in command there from Colonel Mason. Brooks was much delighted in again meeting with this gentleman, and they had a long talk together over the merry times they had when the group were both sleighing at Washington. When heard their destination, he kindly offered to give him a letter of introduction to a very old friend of his, Captain Sutter, the proprietor of Sutter's Fort, and one of the earliest settlers on the Sacramento. He availed himself of his offer, and about 3 o'clock the group started off across the plain and made their way through the groves of fine oak trees which cover it in every direction. The group next ascended the hills which lay between us and Napa Valley, and after crossing them, made for the house of an American settler, a friend of Bradley's, who provided us with the best accommodation his house would furnish for the night. The group turned in early, but the legions of fleas which were their bedfellows exerted themselves to such a degree that for hours sleep was out of the question. The country is terribly plagued with these vermin. He do not know how the settlers get on. Perhaps they are accustomed to the infliction, but a stranger feels it severely. The next day the group traveled over the corresponding range of hills to those crossed on Thursday, and were soon in the midst of a much wilder-looking country, a rapid succession of steep and rugged mountains, thickly timbered with tall pine trees and split up with deep precipitous ravines, hemming in beautiful and fertile valleys, brilliant with golden flowers and dotted over with noble oaks. While the group were riding down one of these dangerous chasms, Bradley, who was showing off his superior equitation, was thrown from his horse and fell rather severely on his arm. On examining it, Brooks was surprised to find he had escaped a fracture. As it was, he has injured it sufficiently to prevent him from using the limb for several days. He bandaged it up, put it in a sling, and he proceeded in a more cautious manner. Tonight the group used their tent for the first time. The group were somewhat awkward in pitching it, and 3 times did the whole structure come down by the run, burying several of us in the flapping canvas and inflicting some tolerably hard knocks with the poles. However, at length the group succeeded in getting it fixed, and kindling a blazing fire close to it, as a polite intimation to the bears that they were not wanted, cooked their supper over the embers, and then, wrapped in their blankets, slept far better than the fleas had allowed us to do the night before. That morning he examined Bradley's arm and was glad to find the inflammation somewhat reduced. He was bruised a good deal about the body generally, and complained that day sorely of the pain he felt while being jolted over the broken ground, which the group crossed in their ascent of the tall mountains that bound the Sacramento Valley. From their summit the group obtained a noble view of the broad winding river and its smaller tributaries, thickly studded with islands overgrown with noble oaks and sycamores. The group encamped tonight at the foot of these hills, near a little stream which gurgled merrily by. The group have seen several herds of elk that day, and a large quantity of wild fowl. Sunday, May 28th. That day they made a long halt, for the group were all exceedingly tired, and some of their pack horses, which were heavily laden, showed symptoms of giving out. The group determined, therefore, to stay there till late in the day, and then to follow the course of the creek for a few miles, and there pitch their tent. Turning their horses loose to graze, several of the party went off on a hunting excursion on foot, but their only success was about a score of wild geese, which are very plentiful in the marshy land bordering the creek. He got a shot at an elk which came down to the water to drink, but he made off unhurt. The smoke that so gracefully curled over other parts of the valley that there were several other camps pitched at no great distance. When the group started in the morning, the group fell in with a few parties moving towards the Sacramento. A ride of a few hours brought us to the borders of that noble river, which was there about a couple of 100 yards wide, and the group immediately made preparations for crossing it. After several mishaps and delays, the group at length succeeded in getting over in a launch. The new town of Suttersville, numbering some 10 or 12 houses, is laid out within half a mile of the banks of the river. From there, a brisk ride over a level plain, parceled out into fields of wheat and pasture grounds, dotted with hundreds upon hundreds of grazing cattle, and there a loitering team, brought us to Sutter's Fort, an extensive block of building planted on the top of a small hill which skirts a creek running into the Americanos, near its junction with the Rio Sacramento. A schooner and some small craft were beating up the Americanos River towards the fort, and alongside the landing place, several launches were lying unshipping cargoes. As they made the spot, the group soon saw that there all was bustle and activity. Boatmen were shouting and swearing. Wagoners were whistling and hallooing and cracking their whips at their straining horses, as these twirled along with heavily laden wagons to the different stores within the building. Groups of horsemen were riding to and fro, and crowds of people were moving about on foot. It was evident that the gold mania increased in force as the group approached the now eagerly longed for El Dorado. On inquiring of a squaw the group met at the entrance of the fort, and who knew just sufficient English to understand their question. She pointed out to us as Captain Sutter a very tall, good-looking sort of personage, wearing a straw hat and loose coat and trousers of striped duck, but with features as unlike those of a Yankee as can well be imagined. He at once introduced himself and handed him the letter which Lieutenant Sherman had given him. After reading it, the captain informed him that he was happy enough to see him, although he feared, from the great change which a few weeks had made in this part of the world, that he could offer him but indifferent hospitality. Every store and shed was being crammed with bales of goods, barrels of flour, and 1,000 other things for which a demand has suddenly sprung up. The captain's own house was indeed just like an hotel, crowded with many more visitors than it could accommodate. Still no one who came there, so the captain was good enough to say, recommended by his friend Sherman, should have other than an hospitable reception. All that he could do, however, he said, would be to place one sleeping room at his service for himself and such of his friends as he liked to share it with, and leaving him to arrange the matter with them, he went away, promising to return and show us their quarters. He told his companions of the captain's offer, but they were satisfied to rough it out of doors again tonight, and it was arranged that only Bradley and himself should accept the sleeping accommodation offered by Captain Sutter, as a good night's rest in comfortable quarters would be more beneficial to their friend with the injured limb than an outdoor nap with a single blanket for a bed and a saddle for a pillow. Two of their horses having cast their shoes, Malcolm and Jose walked them round to the blacksmith's shop, where, after their losses were repaired, a stock of shoes, nails, etc., were to be laid in for future contingencies. MacPhail and their Spanish friend undertook at the same time to purchase a 10 days' supply of provisions for us, and Bradley agreed to look about the fort and see if he could meet with another servant. In this errand, he was sorry to say, he was not successful. While these several commissions were executing, the captain returned and walked with him through the fort. On their way he pointed out the guardhouse, the Indian soldiers attached to which had deserted to the mines almost to a man, the woolen factory, with some 30 women still at work, the distillery house, where the famous pisco is made, and the blacksmiths and wheelwrights' shops, with more work before them than the few mechanics left will be able to get through in a month. Yet all these men talked of starting off to the diggings in a day or two. The captain told him he had only been able to keep them by greatly increased pay, and by an almost unlimited allowance of pisco and whiskey. It was not easy to pick their way through the crowds of strange people who were moving backwards and forwards in every direction. Carts were passing to and fro. Groups of Indians squatting on their haunches were chattering together and displaying to one another the flaring red and yellow handkerchiefs, the scarlet blankets, and muskets of the most worthless Brummagem make, for which they had been exchanging their bits of gold, while their squaws looked on with the most perfect indifference. He observed one chief, who had gone for 30 years with no other covering than a rag to hide his nakedness, endeavoring to thrust his legs into a pair of sailor's canvas trousers with very indifferent success. Inside the stores, the bustle and noise were even greater. Some half a dozen sharp-visaged Yankees, in straw hats and loose frocks, were driving hard bargains for dollars with the crowds of customers who were continually pouring in to barter a portion of their stock of gold for coffee and tobacco, breadstuff, brandy and bowie knives. Of spades and mattocks there were none to be had. In one corner, at a railed-off desk, a quick-eyed old man was busily engaged, with weights and scales, setting his own value on the lumps of golden ore or the bags of dust which were being handed over to him, and in exchange for which he told out the estimated quantity of dollars. Those dollars quickly returned to the original deposit, in payment for goods bought at the other end of the store. Among the clouds of smoke puffed forth by some score of pipes and as many cigarettes, there were to be seen, mingled together, Indians of various degrees of civilization, and corresponding styles of dress, varying from the solitary cloth kilt to the cotton shirts and jackets and trousers of Russia duck. With groups of trappers from as far up as Oregon, clad in coats of buffalo hide, and with faces and hands so brown and wrinkled that one would take their skins to be as tough as the buffaloes, and almost as indifferent to a lump of lead. "Captain," said one of these gentry, shaking a bag of gold as the group passed, "he guessed this beats beaver skins, eh, Captain?" Another of them, who had a savage-looking wolf dog with him, was holding a palaver with an Indian from the borders of the Klamath Lake, and the most friendly understanding seemed to exist between them. "You see those two scoundrels," said the captain to him. "They look and talk for all the world like brothers, but only let either of them get the chance of a shot at the other after scenting his trail, maybe for days, across those broad hunting grounds, where every man they meet they look upon as a foe, and the one that has the quickest eye and the readiest hand will alone live to see the sun rise next day." Threading his way amongst the crowd, Brooks was somewhat struck by the appearance of a Spanish don of the old school, looking as magnificent as a very gaudy light blue jacket with silver buttons and scarlet trimmings, and breeches of crimson velvet and striped silk sash, and embroidered deerskin shoes, and a perfumed cigaretto could make him. He wore his slouched sombrero jauntily placed on one side, and beneath it, of course, the everlasting black silk handkerchief, with the corners dangling over the neck behind. Following him was his servant, in slouched hat and spangled garters, carrying an old Spanish musket over his shoulder, and casting somewhat timid looks at the motley assemblage of Indians and trappers, who every now and then jostled against him. Beyond these, there were a score or two of go-ahead Yankees, gentlemen traders, he supposed they called themselves, with a few pretty Californian women who are on their way with their husbands to the mines. He noticed that the captain had a word for almost everyone, and that he seemed to be held in very great respect. Bradley informed him tonight of the origin of a scar which is just distinguishable in Captain Sutter's face. It seems that the captain, who is a Swiss, was one of Charles X's guards in 1830, and that a slight cut from the saber of one of the youths of the Polytechnic School had left in his visage a standing memorial of the 3 glorious days. Indeed, the captain seems generally to have taken the side of the constituted authorities, as in thy revolution of 1845, he turned out with all his people for the Mexican government. However, he was more fortunate in California than in Paris, as he didn't even get his skin scratched on this occasion. Ferrier's assistance the previous day, and he came to him in the evening to inform him that he and the rest were going into camp for the night. Bradley and himself found an ample supper prepared for us, and after doing due justice to the eatables and dressing Bradley's arm, he shortened the night a couple of hours by jotting down the events of the day. That morning he rose early and walked to the camp, which he found, about half a mile off, under some oaks in a piece of pasture land on the captain's farm. He had some difficulty in finding it out, for there were at least 15 or 20 tents of one kind or another in the bottom. The party were all roused, and breakfast was preparing under Don Lewis's superintendence. It was the general opinion that the group must buy 2 extra horses to carry their breadstuffs, etc. Malcolm reported that there were a variety of articles the group were still in want of, namely, tin drinking cups, some buckets for water, with forks and other small articles. He recommended that a couple more axes and a strong saw be bought at Brannan's, together with hammers, nails, etc., and some of the Indian baskets which seemed to be so common about there. On his return to the fort, he fell in with the captain, rigged out in a military undress uniform. He chatted with him for half an hour about his farm, etc. He told him that he was the first white man who settled in this part of the country, that some 10 years ago, when the Mexican government was full of colonization schemes, the object of which was to break up the missions and to introduce a population antagonistic to the Californians, he received a grant of land, 60 miles one way and 12 another, about 16 or 1700 acres of which he had now brought under cultivation. When he came there, said the captain, he knew the country and the Indians well. 8 years ago these fields were overgrown with long rank grass, with there and there an oak or pine sprouting out from the midst. You can see what they are now. As to the Indians, they gave him a little more trouble. He can boast of 14 pieces of cannon, though one has little occasion for them now, except to fire a few salutes on days of rejoicing. Most of these guns came from Ross within the last 4 years, but when he first arrived there, he brought with him a couple of howitzers, from which one night, when these thieves were hemming him in on all sides, he discharged a shell right over their heads. The mere sight of it, when it bursted, was sufficient to give them a very respectful notion of the fighting means at his command. But though this saved him from any direct attack, it did not secure him against having his horses and cattle stolen on every convenient occasion. The captain went on to say that he at last brought the Indians pretty well under control, and that, by promises of articles of clothing, they became willing to work for him. He took good care to trust very few of them with rifles or powder and shot. Nearly every brick in the buildings of the fort, he tells him, was made by the Indians, who, moreover, dug all the ditches dividing his wheat fields. These ditches are very necessary to prevent the large number of cattle and horses on the farm from straying among the crops. On their way to the house, he got the captain to speak to Thed blacksmith about their horses, after which the party traveled in to breakfast, when he observed his wife and daughter for the first time. They are both very ladylike women, and both natives of France. During the meal, he found Captain Sutter communicative on the subject of the discovery of the gold mines, which Brooks was very glad of, as Brooks was anxious to learn the true particulars of the affair, respecting which so many ridiculous stories had been circulated. One was to the effect that the mines had been discovered by the Mormons, in accordance with a prophecy made by the famous Joe Smith. Another tale was that the captain had seen the apparition of an Indian chief, to whom he had given a rifle, the possession of which he only lived 3 months to enjoy, having been trampled down by a buffalo in the neighborhood of the Rocky Mountains, on his way with his tribe to make an attack on the Pawnees. When the ghost in question told the captain that he would make him very rich, and begged that, with this promised cash, the captain would immediately buy a shipload of rifles, and present one to every member of his tribe. Such were the absurd stories circulated. The true account of the discovery he there give, as near as he can recollect, in the captain's own words. Brooks was sitting one afternoon, said the captain, just after his siesta, engaged, by the by, in writing a letter to a relation of mine at Lucerne, when Brooks was interrupted by Mr. Marshall, a gentleman with whom he had frequent business transactions, bursting hurriedly into the room. From the unusual agitation in his manner, he imagined that something serious had occurred, and as the group involuntarily do in this part of the world, he at once glanced to see if his rifle was in its proper place. You should know that the mere appearance of Mr. Marshall at that moment in the fort was quite enough to surprise him, as he had but 2 days before left the place to make some alterations in a mill for sawing pine planks, which he had just run up for him, some miles higher up the Americanos. When he had recovered himself a little, he told him that, however great his surprise might be at his unexpected reappearance, it would be much greater when heard the intelligence he had come to bring him. Intelligence, he added, which, if properly profited by, would put both of us in possession of unheard-of wealth, millions and millions of dollars in fact. He frankly owned, when heard this, that he thought something had touched Marshall's brain, when suddenly all his misgivings were put an end to by his flinging on the table a handful of scales of pure virgin gold. Brooks was fairly thunderstruck and asked him to explain what all this meant, when he went on to say that, according to his instructions, he had thrown the mill wheel out of gear to let the whole body of the water in the dam find a passage through the tail race, which was previously too narrow to allow the water to run off in sufficient quantity, whereby the wheel was prevented from efficiently performing its work. By this alteration, the narrow channel was considerably enlarged, and a mass of sand and gravel carried off by the force of the torrent. Early in the morning after this took place, Mr. Marshall, was walking along the left bank of the stream when he perceived something which he at first took for a piece of opal, a clear transparent stone very common there, glittering on one of the spots laid bare by the sudden crumbling away of the bank. He paid no attention to this, but while he was giving directions to the workmen, having observed several similar glittering fragments, his curiosity was so far excited that he stooped down and picked one of them up. "Do you know," said Mr. Marshall to him, he positively debated within himself 2 or 3 times whether he should take the trouble to bend his back to pick up one of the pieces, and had decided on not doing so, when, further on, another glittering morsel caught his eye, the largest of the pieces now before you. He condescended to pick it up, and to his astonishment found that it was a thin scale of what appears to be pure gold. He then gathered some 20 or 30 similar pieces, which on examination convinced him that his suppositions were right. His first impression was that this gold had been lost or buried there by some early Indian tribe, perhaps some of those mysterious inhabitants of the West, of whom the group have no account, but who dwelt on this continent centuries ago and built those cities and temples, the ruins of which are scattered about these solitary wilds. On proceeding, however, to examine the neighboring soil, he discovered that it was more or less auriferous. This at once decided him. He mounted his horse and rode down to him as fast as it would carry him with the news. At the conclusion of Mr. Marshall's account, continued Captain Sutter, and when he had convinced himself, from the specimens he had brought with him, that it was not exaggerated, Brooks felt as much excited as himself. He eagerly inquired if he had shown the gold to the workpeople at the mill, and was glad to hear that he had not spoken to a single person about it. The group agreed, said the captain, smiling, not to mention the circumstance to anyone, and arranged to set off early the next day for the mill. On their arrival, just before sundown, the group poked the sand about in various places, and before long succeeded in collecting between us more than an ounce of gold, mixed up with a good deal of sand. He stayed at Mr. Marshall's that night, and the next day the group proceeded some little distance up the South Fork, and found that gold existed along the whole course, not only in the bed of the main stream, where the water had subsided, but in every little dried-up creek and ravine. Indeed, he think it was more plentiful in these latter places, for he himself, with nothing more than a small knife, picked out from a dry gorge, a little way up the mountain, a solid lump of gold which weighed nearly an ounce and a half. On their return to the mill, the group were astonished by the work-people coming up to us in a body, and showing us small flakes of gold similar to those they had ourselves procured. Marshall tried to laugh the matter off with them, and to persuade them that what they had found was only some shining mineral of trifling value. But one of the Indians who had worked at the gold mine in the neighborhood of La Paz in Lower California cried out, "Oro! Oro!" The group were disappointed enough at this discovery, and supposed that the work-people had been watching their movements, although the group thought they had taken every precaution against being observed by them. Heard afterwards that one of them, a sly Kentuckian, had dogged us about, and that, looking on the ground to see if he could discover what the group were in search of, he had lighted on some flakes of gold himself. The next day he rode back to the fort, organized a laboring party, set the carpenters to work on a few necessary matters, and the next day accompanied them to a point of the fork, where they encamped for the night. By the following morning he had a party of 50 Indians fairly at work. The way the group first managed was to shovel the soil into small buckets, or into some of their famous Indian baskets, then wash all the light earth out and pick away the stones. After this, the group dried the sand on pieces of canvas, and with long reeds blew away all but the gold. He had now some rude machines in use, and upwards of 100 men employed, chiefly Indians, who are well fed and who are allowed whiskey 3 times a day. The report soon spread. Some of the gold was sent to San Francisco, and crowds of people flocked to the diggings. Added to this, a large immigrant party of Mormons entered California across the Rocky Mountains, just as the affair was first made known. They halted at once and set to work on a spot some 30 miles from there, where a few of them still remain. When Brooks was last up at the diggings, there were full 800 men at work, at one place and another, with perhaps something like 300 more passing backwards and forwards between there and the mines. He at first imagined the gold would soon be exhausted by such crowds of seekers, but subsequent observations have convinced him that it will take many years to bring about such a result, even with 10 times the present number of people employed. What surprises him, continued the captain, is that this country should have been visited by so many scientific men, and that not one of them should have ever stumbled upon these treasures, that scores of keen-eyed trappers should have crossed this valley in every direction, and tribes of Indians have dwelt in it for centuries, and yet that this gold should have never been discovered. He himself have passed the very spot above 100 times during the last 10 years, but was just as blind as the rest of them, so he must not wonder at the discovery not having been made earlier. While the captain was proceeding with his narrative, he must confess that Brooks felt so excited on the subject as to wish to start off immediately on their journey. When he had finished, he walked off to see after the horses, but although they were ready, the additional shoes the group wanted to carry with us would not be furnished for several hours. It was late in the afternoon before the group got them. The group bought 2 horses of Captain Sutter, very strong animals, and MacPhail managed to engage a big lad as a servant, a rough-looking fellow who appears to have deserted from some ship and worked his way up there. All things considered, it was agreed that the group should remain there another night and resume their march as early as the group could in the morning. Excitement. Down in the bottom, some 20 tents were pitched, outside which big fires were smoking, and while breakfast was being prepared, the men of each company were busily engaged in saddling their horses and arranging their baggage. Several wagons and teams were already in motion, following the road along the windings of the river. The tents were soon all struck, the smoke from the fires was dying away, and a perfect caravan was moving along in the direction of the now no longer ridiculed El Dorado. The group pushed along, as may be believed, with the utmost impatience, conjuring up the most flattering visions of their probable success as gold hunters. The track lay through a spacious grassy valley, with the Americanos River winding along it on their left hand. At first, the stream was nearly 2 miles distant from the track of their caravan, but as the group advanced, the group approached its banks more nearly. The country was pleasant, consisting of a succession of small hills and valleys, diversified there and there by groves of tall oak trees. The group passed several wretched Indian villages, clusters of filthy, smoky hovels, and now and then caught sight of the river and the line of oak trees which bordered it. The group managed tolerably well with their horses, but it requires great experience to be able to fasten securely the loads of provisions and stores which they carry on their backs. Flour, of course, formed the principal article of their commissariat. This was packed up in sacks, which were again enclosed in long pockets made of hides and called parfleches, the use of which is to defend the canvas of the sacking from being torn by branches of fern and underwood. The sacks the group secured on strong pack saddles, between which and the back of the horse were some thick soft claws. All their baggage horses were furnished with trail ropes, which were allowed to drag on the ground after the horse, for the purpose of enabling us to catch him more readily. Besides the animals the group rode, they had 7 horses, for the conveyance of their provisions, tents, etc. The 2 the group bought from Captain Sutter, though strong, were skittish, and gave us much trouble, for their newly engaged servant, whose name is James Horry, knew more about harpooning and flenching whales than about the management of horses. He was certainly willing and did his best, but he occasioned some mirth during the day's march by his extreme awkwardness on horseback. However, to do him justice, he bore the numerous falls which he came in for with great philosophy, starting up again every time he was grasped, and laughing as loudly as the rest. At noon the group halted to refresh by the side of a small stream of crystal purity. While making preparations for their hurried meal, they had all their eyes about us for gold in the channel of the rivulet, but saw none. They had not yet reached the favored spot. After some difficulty in catching the pack horses, one of the perverse brutes having taken it into its head to march up to its belly in the stream, where he floundered about for some time, enjoying the coolness of the water, the group set forward, determined to reach the lower diggings by sundown. As the group neared the spot, the ground gradually became more broken and heavily timbered with oak and pine, while in the distance, and separated from us by deep forests of these trees, might be seen a long ridge of snow-capped mountains, the lofty Sierra Nevada. But the group were too anxious to reach the gold to care much about the more unprofitable beauties of nature, and accordingly urged their horses to the quickest speed they could put forth. The group were now traveling along the river's banks, and towards evening came in sight of the lower mines. They are called the Mormon Diggings, which occupy a surface of 2 or 3 miles along the river. There were something like 40 tents scattered up the hillsides, occupied mostly by Americans, some of whom had brought their families with them. Although it was near sundown, everybody was in full occupation. At every few yards there were men, with their naked arms, busily employed in washing out the golden flakes and dust from spadefuls of the auriferous soil. Others were first passing it through sieves, many of them freshly made with intertwisted willow branches, to get rid of the coarse stones, and then washing the lumps of soil in pots placed beneath the surface of the water, the contents of the vessel being kept continually stirred by the hand until the lighter particles of earth or gravel were carried away. A great number of the settlers, however, were engaged in making what are there called cradles, partly, he supposed, from their shape, and partly from the rocking motion to which they are subjected. These machines were being roughly constructed of deal boards. Later in the day he watched one of them at work and had the process explained to him. 4 men were employed at it. The first shoveled up the earth, another carried it to the cradle and dashed it down on a grating or sieve, placed horizontally at the head of the machine, the wires of which, being close together, only allowed the smaller particles of earth and sand to fall through. The third man rocked the cradle. He must confess he never saw one so perseveringly rocked at home, while the fourth kept flinging water upon the mass of earth inside. The result of this fourfold process is that the lighter earth is gradually carried off by the action of the water, and a sort of thick black sediment of sand is left at the bottom of the cradle. This was afterwards scooped out and put aside to be carefully dried in the sun the following day morning. He can hardly describe the effect this sight produced upon the expedition. It seemed as if the fabled treasure of the Arabian Nights had been suddenly realized before us. The group all shook hands and swore to preserve good faith with each other and to work hard for the common good. The gold finders told us that some of them frequently got as much as $50 a day. As the group rode from camp to camp and saw the hoards of gold, some of it in flakes, but the greater part in a coarse sort of dust, which these people had amassed during the last few weeks, the group felt in a perfect fluster of excitement at the sight of the wealth around us. One man showed us 400 ounces of pure gold dust which he had washed from the dirt in a tin pan, and which he valued at $14 an ounce. As may be imagined, the whole scene was one well calculated to take a strong hold upon the imagination. The eminences, rising gradually from the river's banks, were dotted with white canvas tents, mingled with the more somber-looking huts, constructed with once green but now withered branches. A few hundred yards from the river lay a large heap of planks and framings, which Brooks was told were intended for constructing a store, the owner of which, a sallow Yankee with a large pluffy cigaretto in his mouth, was laboring away in his shirt sleeves. Bewildered and excited by the novelty of the scene, The group were in haste to pitch their camp and soon fixed upon a location. This was by the side of a dried-up watercourse, through which, in the wet season, a small rivulet joined the larger stream. The group did not, however, immediately set to work to make the necessary arrangements for the night. Their fingers were positively itching for the gold, and in less than half an hour after their arrival, the pack horse which carried the shovels, scoops, and pans had been released of his burden, and all the expedition were as busily employed as the rest. As for himself, armed with a large scoop or trowel and a shallow tin pail, he leapt into the bed of the rivulet at a spot where he perceived no trace of the gravel and earth having been artificially disturbed. Near him was a small clear pool, which served for washing the gold. Some of the expedition set to work within a short distance of him, while others tried their fortune along the banks of the Americanos, digging up the shingle which lay at the very brink of the stream. He shall not soon forget the feeling with which he first plunged his scoop into the soil beneath him. Half filling his tin pail with the earth and shingle, he carried it to the pool, and placing it beneath the surface of the water, he began to stir it with his hand, as he had observed the other diggers do. Of course, Brooks was not very expert at first, and he dare say he flung out a good deal of the valuable metal. However, he soon perceived that the earth was crumbling away, and was being carried by the agitation of the water into the pool, which speedily became turbid, while the sandy sediment of which he had heard remained at the bottom of the pail. Carefully draining the water away, he deposited the sand in one of the small, close-woven Indian baskets they had brought with us, with the intention of drying it at the campfire, there not being sufficient time before nightfall to allow the moisture gradually to absorb by the evaporation of the atmosphere. After working for about half an hour, he retraced his steps with his basket to the spot where they had tethered the horses, and found the animals still standing there with their burdens on their backs. Malcolm was already there. He had with him about an equal quantity of the precious black sand. It remained, however, to be seen what proportion of gold their heaps contained. In a short time, Bradley and Don Lewis joined us, both of them in tip-top spirits. "He guessed this is the way the group do the trick down in these clearings," said the former, shaking a bag of golden sand. As for Jose, Don Lewis's Indian servant, he was devout in his expressions of thanksgiving to the Virgin Mary and the Great Spirit, whom he would insist upon classifying together in a most remarkable and not quite orthodox manner. The group now set to work to get up their tent. Malcolm, in the meantime, prepared coffee and very underbaked cakes made of the flour they had brought with us. His cooking operations were greatly impeded by their eagerness to dry the sand they had scraped up, a feat in the achievement of which Bradley was clumsy enough to burn a hole in their very best saucepan. However, the group managed to get the moisture absorbed, and shutting their eyes, the group commenced blowing away the sand with their mouths, and shortly after found ourselves the possessors of a few pinches of gold. This was encouraging for a beginning. The group drunk their coffee in high spirits, and then, having picketed their horses, made ourselves as snug as their accommodation would allow, and being tired out, not only with the journey and the work, but with excitement and anxiety, slept soundly till morning. The morning broke brilliantly, and the first thing the group discovered on rising was that 2 of the horses had broken their fastenings during the night and strayed. As the group could not afford to lose the animals, Jose and Horry were dispatched low look after them, and they grumbled not a little at being thus sent off from the scene of golden operations. But Bradley, producing a rifle, swore that he would shoot them both unless they obeyed orders. So, after a little altercation, away they went. Breakfast was soon dispatched, and the question as to the day's operations asked. Don Lewis was the only one who, on the score of its being Sunday, would not go to the diggings. He had no objection to amuse himself on Sunday, but he would not work. To get over the difficulty, the group agreed to go upon the principle of every man keeping his own findings. their bonds of unity as a party to extend merely to mutual protection and defense. Leaving Don Lewis, then, smoking in the tent, the group proceeded to work and found that the great majority of the gold finders appeared to entertain their opinions, or at all events to imitate their practice, as to laboring on the Sunday. He had now leisure more particularly to remark the nature of the soil in which the gold was found. The dust is found amid the shingle actually below water, but the most convenient way of proceeding is to take the soil from that portion of the bed which has been overflowed but is now dry. It was principally of a gravelly nature, full of small stones, composed, as far as he could make out, of a species of jasper and milky quality, mingled with fragments of slate and splinters of basalt. The general opinion is that the gold has been washed down from the hills. He worked hard, as indeed the group all did, the whole morning. The toil is very severe, the constant stooping pressing, of course, upon the spinal column, whilst the constant immersion of the hands in water causes the skin to excoriate and become exceedingly painful. But these inconveniences are slight when compared to the great gain by which one is recompensed for them. At 12 o'clock, their usual primitive dinner hour, the group met at the tents, tolerably well tired with their exertions. No dinner, however, was prepared, both Jose and Horry being still absent in pursuit of the strayed horses. They had therefore to resort to some of their jerked beef, which, with biscuits and coffee, formed their fare. After dinner, the group determined to rest until the next day. The fact is that the human frame will not stand and was never intended to stand, a course of incessant toil. Indeed, he believed that in civilized, that is to say, in industrious communities, the Sabbath, bringing round as it does a stated remission from labor, is an institution physically necessary. The group therefore passed some time in conversation, which was interrupted by the arrival of Jose and Horry with the strayed horses. Horry demanded an immediate increase of wages, threatening to leave us and set to work on his own account if the group refused. Bradley tried to talk big and bully him, but in vain. Jose had a sort of fear of Don Lewis, who in return looked on his servant as his slave, so he said nothing. The group could see, however, that they had evidently been in communication with the diggers around, and so the group gave in. Later in the afternoon, he started with Malcolm and MacPhail for a walk through the diggings. They discovered comparatively a small proportion of the people who had commenced work in the morning still at their pans. Numbers were lying asleep under the trees or in the shade of their tents and wagons. Others sat smoking and chatting in circles upon the grass, mending their clothes or performing other little domestic duties at the same time. It was really a motley scene. Indians strutted by in all the pride of gaudy calico, the manners of the savage concealed beneath the dress of the civilized man. Muscular, sunburnt fellows, whose fine forms and swarthy faces pronounced that Spanish blood ran through their veins, gossiped away with sallow hatchet-faced Yankees, smart men at a bargain, and always on the lookout for squalls. There and there one spied out the flannel shirt and coarse canvas trousers of a seaman, a runaway, in all probability, from a South Sea whaler, while one or two stray Negroes chattered with all the volubility of their race, shaking their woolly heads and showing their white teeth. He got into conversation with one tall American. He was a native-born Kentuckian, and full of the bantam sort of consequence of his race. He predicted wonderful things from the discovery of the mineral treasures of California, observing that it would make a monetary revolution all over the world, and that nothing similar, at least to so great an extent, was ever known in history. "Look around. For stranger," said he to him, "he guess you don't realize such a scene every day, and that's a fact. There's gold to be had for the picking of it up, and by all who choose to come and work. He reckon old John Bull will scrunch up his fingers in his empty pockets when he comes to hear of it. It's a most everlasting, wonderful thing, and that's a fact that beats Joe Duncan's goose pie and apple sarce." Farther on the group came upon a tremendous-looking tent, formed by 2 or 3 tents being flung into one, which, on examination, they discovered was doing duty as a chapel. A missionary from one of the New England states, as here, was holding forth to a pretty large congregation. The place was very hot and choky, and he only stayed long enough to hear that the discourse abounded in the cloudy metaphors and vague technicalities of Calvinistic theology. The remainder of the afternoon he had been devoting to writing his journal, which he there brake off to commence a hearty good supper, in revenge for the scrambling sort of dinner one has had that day. The beef doesn't look roasted as they would put it on the table at the Clarendon, or at a storehouse even, but none of those who sit down to the Clarendon table at any rate have such an appetite as he now have, far away beyond care and civilization, in the gold-gathering region of California. Good success. He began to hope now that he had really laid the foundation of a fortune, and he thanked God for it. He had been kicked tolerably well about the world, and the proverb that a rolling stone gathers no moss has, he was sure, been abundantly proved by his case. Now, however, he had a grand chance, and he was resolved that all that industry and perseverance can do shall be done to improve it. Before starting for work that morning, it was agreed that Jose should act as cook for the day, it being stipulated that he was to have the afternoon to himself for digging. Horry was left in charge of the horses. He worked hard, keeping near Bradley and conversing with him as he shoveled the gravel into the pail and stirred it about in the clear pools. They had very fair success, but still the group could not but think that this was a poor way of proceeding. Besides, he didn't like the back-breaking work of stooping all day. He therefore proposed that the group should endeavor to knock up a cradle. The expense for wood would certainly be great, but it would be better to incur it than keep to the present rude and toilsome plan of operation. The group proposed the plan to their comrades at dinner time, and it was, on the whole, well received. Malcolm and MacPhail entered into the notion, and the group determined to try whether the group could not put forth sufficient carpentering ability to carry it out. The next day was fixed upon for commencing the work. After dinner, the group returned to their shovels and pails. In the evening, the group were anxious to know how much gold they had realized by their labors up to the present time, and accordingly, he set off to borrow a pair of scales. After entering several tents in vain, Brooks was directed to the Yankee who had the materials for a store, and whose name was Hiram and Slow. He had several pairs to sell, but none to lend. He asked his prices, and now had, for the first time, a real example of the effects of plenty of gold and scarcity of goods. For a small pair of ordinary brass scales, with a set of troy weights, he paid, on behalf of the party, $15, the seller consoling him by the information that in his opinion, if the gold hunters continued to pour in for a fortnight longer, he would not have got the article for 3 times the amount. Furnished with his purchase, he returned to the tent, and the stock of gold dust realized by each man was weighed and computed at the current rate in which the mercantile transactions of this little colony are reckoned, namely, $14 each ounce of gold dust. They discovered that MacPhail and Malcolm had been, upon the whole, the most successful, each having obtained nearly 2 ounces of pure gold dust, valued at $28. He himself had about $23 worth, and Bradley had $25 worth, an amount which, considerable though it was, the group hoped greatly to increase as soon as the group get their cradle into operation. During the day there were numerous arrivals from Sutter's fort, and in his opinion these diggings will soon be overcrowded. 2 of the newcomers were known to Bradley, one, a Mr. Biggs, a shipping agent from San Francisco, the other, Mr. Lacasse, a French-Canadian who has recently settled in California. They accepted their offer for them to join the expedition. If this influx of people continues, he thinks the Yankee with the store will do better than anyone, and keeping a shanty will be a far more profitable speculation than handling a shovel or working a cradle. What surprises him is that in this remote spot, so distant from anything that can be called law, so much tranquility prevails under the circumstances. one hears of no deeds of violence or even dishonesty. In fact, theft would hardly pay. The risk would be more than the advantage, for if anyone was detected plundering, he would soon have a rifle bullet put through him. One thing in favor of good order is that there is no unequal distribution of property, no favored classes. Every man who has a spade or a trowel and hands to use them is upon an equality and can make a fortune with a rapidity hitherto almost unknown in the history of the world. Sunday, June 11th. Nearly a week has elapsed since he last opened his diary. On Tuesday, the group set to work upon their cradle. The group resolved upon the construction of two, and for this purpose went down to the store in a body to see about the boards. They discovered the timber extravagantly dear, being asked $40 a hundred. After some bargaining, the group obtained sufficient for their purpose, at the rate of $35. The next question was as to whether the group should hire a carpenter. The group were told there were one or two in the diggings who might be hired, though at a very extravagant rate. Accordingly, Bradley and he proceeded to see one of these gentlemen and found him washing away with a hollow log and a willow branch sieve. He offered to help us at the rate of $35 a day, the group finding provisions and tools, and could not be brought to charge less. The group thought this by far too extravagant and left him, determined to undertake the work ourselves. Meantime, Horry had brought down two of their horses with him to the store. The group loaded them immediately with boards and returned to their tent. After breakfast, which consisted of coffee without milk, flour cakes, and strips of dried beef, roasted on the embers, the group set to work. They had a sufficient number of axes and a good stout saw, one large plane and a few strong chisels, with plenty of nails. As may be expected, the group proved to be very awkward carpenters. Lacos was perhaps the handiest, and Malcolm not much inferior to him, until the latter unfortunately received a severe cut with a chisel, extending in a transverse line along the joint of the forefinger of the left hand. He strapped up the wound, but the rough work soon tore away the diaculum. No bad consequences, however, ensued. The wound, in spite of the hard treatment which it received, closed and healed by the first intention, proving healthy habit of body engendered by temperance and constant exercise in the open air. In building their cradles, or gold canoes, as the Indians called them, they discovered that to mortise the planks into each other was a feat of carpentering far above their skill, particularly as they had no mortise chisels. The group were therefore obliged to adopt the ruder experiment of making the boards overlap each other by about an inch, nailing them firmly together in that position. As, however, the inequality of surface at the bottom of the cradle, produced by the mode of building, would have materially impeded their operations, the group strained some pieces of tarred canvas, which the group fortunately possessed amongst their tent cloths, over the bottoms, thus rendering the surface even and suited to their purpose. By the time they had got so far with their undertaking, the group felt sufficiently tired to give over work for the night. They had labored unceasingly at them, pausing only to swallow a hasty meal, and stuck by their hammers and chisels till dusk. The group were up early the next morning, and toiled away to get the cradles completed, as the group were constantly seeing proofs of the great advantages of these machines. The group fixed a wicker sieve over thread, by means of a couple of transverse bars, and then set about to construct the working apparatus, which they had all along feared would put their mechanical skill to rather a severe test. But they discovered it easier than they had anticipated, and before sundown the rockers were fixed on both cradles, which, to all intents and purposes, were now ready for use. The work was rather rough, but it was firm and strong. So fearful were the group first of all that their cradles might be removed or tampered with in the night, that he jocularly proposed two of us should give up the shelter of the tent, and like pretty little children, sleep in their cradles till the morning. The next day the group set to work with them with the utmost eagerness, having first dragged the lumbering machines to a likely spot in the vicinity of the water. The labor was hard enough, but nothing compared to the old plan of pot washing, while it saved the hands from the injury inflicted by continual dabbling in sand and water. The group took the different departments of labor by turns and found that the change, by bringing into play different sets of muscles, greatly relieved us and enabled us to keep the stones rolling with great energy. In the evening, with help of their newly purchased scales, the group tested their gains. The cradle, which was worked by Don Lewis, Malcolm, and himself, for it was so near the water that 3 hands were sufficient, had realized 6 ounces of gold dust. The other, attended to by Bradley, MacPhail, Biggs, and Lacoste, had nearly as much. During the day, there was another considerable influx of people to the diggings. The banks of the river are therefore getting more and more crowded, and the group hear that the price of every article of subsistence is rising in the same proportion. Repetition of those of the week previous, the amount of gold dust realized being rather greater, and amounting on an average to very nearly 16 ounces per day. Cradles are now in use everywhere around us. Nevertheless, the numbers who stand in the water washing with tin or wooden bowls do not appear to be diminished. On the evening of Thursday, the group were visited by a gentleman from Monterey, a Mr. Larkin, who, he believed, is connected with the state's government, and who has arrived in the diggings with the view of making a report to the authorities at Washington. Don Lewis immediately recognized him and invited him to spend the evening and night in their tent. The group were very anxious to hear the news from the coast, and Mr. Larkin, in turn, was very anxious to pick up all the information he could get respecting the diggings. Don Lewis says he is a man of large fortune, so his tour is purely one of inspection, and not with any eye to business. They made him as comfortable as the group could. Lacoste exerted himself in the manufacture of the coffee in honor of their guest, and they had several hours of interesting conversation. Larkin said he had no idea what steps the government at Washington would take with reference to the placer. "It can't matter much to you, gentlemen," observed he, "for although there can be no doubt of its being upon public territory, still, before any instructions can be received from Washington, the great body of the diggers and washers there will be enriched to their heart's content, if a man ever does feel contented with any amount of wealth." "Your observation," exclaimed Malcolm, "puts him in mind of a story which his father used to tell of a farmer, a friend of his, who once took his rent, the odd money short, to an old miserly landlord rolling in wealth. He was asked by him why he had not brought the full amount. "Why," replied the farmer, "he thought you had enough." "Enough," said the miser. "Do you know what enough is? He'll tell you enough is something more than a man hath." Mr. Larkin then spoke of the effects of the mineral yellow fever, as he called it, having been most extraordinary in San Francisco. When he left that town, he said more than 2/3 of the houses were deserted. The group were not surprised at this, as the group knew the people who were continually arriving there must have come from somewhere. Nearly all the ships in the harbor, too, had lost a great part of their crews by desertion. A bark called the Amity had only 6 men left when Mr. Larkin started from the port. On board another ship from the Sandwich Islands, the captain was left actually and literally alone. On the road, Mr. Larkin fell in with another captain who had started off for the gold region with every man of his crew, leaving his ship unprotected in port. Larkin remonstrating with him on the flagrancy of his conduct, he merely replied, "Oh, he warned him her cables and anchors are strong enough to last till the group get back." Mr. Larkin told us what the group were fully prepared to hear, namely, that wages and salaries of all classes have risen immensely. Clerks, he said, were getting from $900 to $1,200, instead of from $400 to $550 with their board. Both the Star and California newspapers, he said, had stopped. Thinking to surprise us, he told us that shovels, which used to be $1, were selling in San Francisco when he left for $5 and $6 each. Bradley replied that he thought this was a very reasonable figure, for he had heard $30 offered for a spade that very day. "Do you know, by the by," said Mr. Larkin, "who he observed there that day, up to his knees in water, washing away in a tin pan. Why, a lawyer who was the Attorney General to the King of the Sandwich Islands, not 18 months ago. He guess, said Bradley. He finds gold washing more profitable than Sandwich Island law, but he's not the only one of his brethren that is of much the same spirit. There's lots of lawyers in these diggings. They are better employed now than ever they were in their lives. They're money-getting rascals all the world over, but there they do have to work for it. That's one comfort. Before turning in, the group took a stroll through the camp with Mr. Larkin. It was a bright moonlight night, and some of the more eager diggers were still at work. These were the newcomers, probably, who were too much excited to sleep without trying their hands at washing the golden gravel. Larkin left us the following day. June 23rd, Friday. The last entry in his diary seems to have been written last Sunday. Next day, the group began to find the provisions running short. A consultation was accordingly held upon the subject. It was quite out of the question to buy provisions in the diggings. Work as one might, the day's living of any man with a respectable appetite, and one seems always to feel hungry there, would pretty well absorb the day's labor. The group therefore determined to dispatch Bradley and Jose back to Sutter's fort for a supply, it being stipulated that Bradley should share in the gold the group might find during their absence. This arrangement being duly concluded, they started off the following morning on horseback, driving before them the two beasts the group purchased at Sutter's. The group instructed Bradley, if possible, to buy a light wagon in which to store the provisions he was to bring back. The two extra horses would be able to draw it, and such a vehicle would be useful in many respects. He took with him $250 worth of gold, so as to be in sufficient funds, in case the sum demanded should be an over-exorbitant one. They departed on Tuesday, and the group continued their labors. Towards the afternoon of that day, he had a piece of great good luck. Brooks was digging up the earth to throw into the cradle, when he turned up a lump of ore about the size of a small walnut, which he knew at once was a piece of gold. It weighed 2 ounces and 3/4. This, by the law of the diggings, for it was curious how soon a set of rude regulations sprung into existence, which everybody seemed to abide by, belonged to himself and not to the party, it being found before the earth was thrown into the cradle, and being over 1/2 ounce in weight. Higher up the Sacramento, and particularly on Bear River, one of its tributaries, these lumps and flakes were said to be frequently met with, but at the Mormon Digging they are very rare. On Thursday, about sundown, the group were delighted to see the approach of Bradley with a well-loaded wagon of light but strong construction. He had just arrived in time, for their larder was almost exhausted. The group were prepared, however, to have stood out another day or two on short rations, rather than pay the prices asked at the shanties. Bradley gave us a short account of the expedition. They reached Sutter's in safety, and found the fort as busy as though it was tenanted by a swarm of bees. A sort of hotel had at last been opened, and the landlord was driving a roaring trade. The immigrants were pouring in, purchasing shovels, trowels, pans, and whatever else they wanted at high prices. Profitable as was the washing business, Bradley said he suspected the storekeepers at the fort were clearing more by their branch of the enterprise than if they had their hands in the pan themselves. He found Captain Sutter well and hearty, and the morning after his arrival consulted him about a wagon. The captain, however, had none he felt inclined to sell, nor was there such a thing to be got in the fort. After some consideration, however, Captain Sutter said that Mr. Sinclair, whose ranch was about 3 miles off on the opposite bank of the river, might be able to accommodate him. Accordingly, Bradley made the best of his way there, but found Mr. Sinclair indisposed to trade. At length, after a good deal of persuasion, Bradley succeeded in hiring a wagon and a wagoner of him for a week. The vehicle was got across the river that night. In the morning, he started it off well laden with provisions, and arrived there without any accident the same evening. The group were now well victualled for a month, but were puzzled how to stow away their large stock of provisions, and only accomplished it satisfactorily by giving up the tent for this purpose. This compelled us all to sleep in the open air, but as yet the nights are very mild and pleasant. Among the fresh arrivals at the diggings, the native Californians have begun to appear in tolerable numbers. Many of these people have brought their wives, who are attended usually by Indian girls. The graceful Spanish costume of the newcomers adds quite a feature to the busy scene around. There, working amidst the sallow Yankees, with their wide white trousers and straw hats, and the half-naked Indian, may be seen the native-born Californian, with his dusky visage and lustrous black eye, clad in the universal short tight jacket with its lace adornments, and velvet breeches, with a silk sash fastened round his waist, splashing away with his gay deerskin botas in the mudded water. The appearance of the women is graceful and coquettish. Their petticoats, short enough to display in most instances a well-turned ankle, are richly laced and embroidered, and striped and flounced with gaudy colors, of which scarlet seems to have the preference. Their tresses hang in luxuriant plaits down their backs, and in all the little accessories of dress, such as earrings, necklaces, etc., the costume is very rich. Its distinguishing feature, however, is the rebozo, a sort of scarf generally made of cotton, which answers to the mantilla of old Spain. It was worn in many different and very graceful fashions, sometimes twined round the waist and shoulders, at others, hanging in pretty festoons about the figure, but always disposed with that indescribable degree of coquettish grace which Spanish women have been for ages allowed to possess in the management of the fan and the mantilla. Since these arrivals, almost every evening a fandango is got up on the green, before some of the tents. The term fandango, though originally signifying a peculiar kind of dance, seems to be used there for an evening's dancing entertainment, in which many different are introduced. Brooks was present at a fandango a few nights ago, where a couple of performers were dancing, El Jarab, which seemed to consist chiefly of a series of monotonous toe and heel movements on the ground. The motions of the foot were, however, wonderfully rapid and always in exact time to the music. But at these entertainments the waltz seems to be the standing dish. It was danced with numerous very intricate figures, to which, however, all the Californians appear quite au fait. Men and women alike waltz beautifully, with an easy, graceful, swinging motion. It was quite a treat, after a hard day's work, to go at nightfall to one of these fandangos. The merry notes of the guitar and the violin announce them to all comers, and a motley enough-looking crowd, every member of which is puffing away at a cigar, forms our applauding circle round the dancers, who smoke like the rest. One cannot help being struck by the picturesque costumes and graceful motions of the performers, who appear to dance not only with their legs, but with all their hearts and souls. Lacos is a particular admirer of these fandangos, and he very frequently takes a part in them himself. During the interval between the dances, coffee is consumed by the senoras and coffee with something stronger by the senors, so that, as the night advances, the merriment gets, if not fast and furious, at least animated and imposing. 25th June, Sunday. The group have all of us given over working on Sundays, as they discovered the toil on 6 successive days quite hard enough. Last week they had rather indifferent success, having realized only 19 ounces of gold, barely 3 ounces a man. The dust is weighed out and distributed every evening, and each man carries his portion about his person. Jose, who has amassed a tolerable quantity by working in his spare time, is constantly feeling to see whether his stock is safe. He weighs it 2 or 3 times a day to ascertain, he supposes, whether it exhausts itself by insensible perspiration or other means, and invokes, by turns, every saint in the calendar, his patron saint Joseph in particular, and all his old heathenish spirits to keep his treasure safe. In accordance with a vow he made before he started from Monterey, he has set apart 1/4 of his treasure for the big woman, as he calls the Virgin Mary, in contradistinction to the Great Spirit, he imagined, but he fancy her stock of gold decreases every day, and that Jose doesn't play her fair. They had a great deal of serious conversation this afternoon upon the propriety of moving farther up the river and trying some of the higher washings, for their last week's labor was a terribly poor yield. The group remembered Captain Sutter's account of how Mr. Marshall had first discovered the gold in the vicinity of his mill and how plentiful it seemed to lie there. Besides, the diggings are getting overcrowded, the consequence of which is that the group have had several of their pans and baskets stolen. The group therefore decided that, if the group could sell their cradles to advantage, and there is some likelihood of this, for there is not a carpenter left all through these diggings to make others for the constant newcomers, to move higher up the fork and try their fortune at a less crowded spot. There is one thing that he shall regret leaving himself, and that is the fandango and the 2 or 3 pretty senoritas one has been in the habit of meeting at it almost every night. Determination of moving off from their late quarters, and accordingly, next day he walked with Bradley and MacPhail through the diggings to try to find purchasers for their cradles. This was not a difficult task. They had plenty of offers, and the group were so importuned by some 6 or 8 people who were anxious to trade with us that the group decided in a minute on having an auction of them. Brooks was not bold enough to play the part of auctioneer himself, but Bradley very coolly mounted on the top of one of the machines and called upon gentlemen traders for their biddings. This was a capital move. The highest offer they had previously obtained was $160 for the largest of the 2 machines, but Bradley succeeded in coaxing the purchasers on, stopping now, and then to expatiate on the min of gold which, he guessed, he would warrant it to produce daily, and then calling to their minds the fact that this was the identical cradle into which the lump of gold weighing 2 ounces and 3/4, the largest piece ever found at the Mormon Diggings, was about to have been shoveled when it was discovered and seized hold of by the fortunate digger, the gentleman on his right hand, who, as you all know, in accordance with the admirable laws of these diggings, laid claim to it as his private property. This produced a roar of laughter, but what was better, it produced a roar of biddings, and the cradle was knocked down at $195, payable in gold dust, at the standard rate of $14 the ounce, or a discount of 10% if settled in broad silver pieces. The other cradle fetched us $180. For these 2 cradles, therefore, the group got $375 worth of dust. The same night the group occupied ourselves in constructing strong bags, made of rough hides, and well strapped round the person for the conveyance of the gold dust and scales which they had already amassed. On Wednesday morning, before sunrise, they had sent the wagon and wagoner back to Mr. Sinclair's rancho, accompanied by Jose, who returned on the evening of Thursday with the horses. They discovered, on starting, that their horses could not carry all the provisions, and at the same time perform a good day's work. The group, therefore, left some of the more bulky articles under the charge of a man from San Francisco, known to Bradley, and departed. They made good progress for a mile or 2, and, as the group crossed the brow of a hill, halted a moment to observe the busy aspect of the washings as they appeared from a distance. The country, as the group ascended the stream, became hourly more hilly and broken. Its general aspect was grassy, and the soil appeared fertile. There and there deep gullies crossed their path, over which they had great difficulty in urging the horses, heavily loaded as they were. At one of these ravines, the animal which conveyed the tent poles lost his footing, and went scrambling down the edge of the descent, bearing with him a whole avalanche of gravel and shingles. Malcolm and Lacos went after the brute, and succeeded in forcing it up by a less precipitous path. At noon the group halted and dined. During the afternoon, the group observed a sort of small jackal, of the kind called coyote, hovering about the line of march. It only occasionally showed itself amongst the long rank grass and bushes. Bradley, however, got his rifle ready, but although he fired several shots, the animal was too nimble or restless for even the practiced eye and hand of a Yankee rifleman to be certain of his aim. In a shot at a young antelope which bounded past, however, Bradley was more successful, and the group were rejoiced at the prospect of a supper on tender venison. In a few minutes, he had slung the animal over his horse's haunches, and the group proceeded on their route. The country became more broken and mountainous as the group advanced, and in approaching the location of the sawmills, the hills appeared to rise nearly 1,000 feet above the level of the Sacramento. They were diversified by groves of gigantic pine and oak trees. The group were looking anxiously about for the sawmills when the group heard the crack of a rifle, and presently a man in white linen trousers with his legs defended by buckskin moccasins, wearing a broad Mexican sombrero and carrying his rifle in his hand, approached us. This person turned out to be Mr. Marshall. He received us kindly and asked the news from the lower washings, and also how matters were looking at Sutter's when the group passed through. Marshall had a gang of 50 Indians employed, and Captain Sutter had another party of nearly double that number on the same bank of the river. The group encamped in a woody bottom by the side of a small stream, which joined the main torrent there, and where there was good pasture for the horses. Marshall's house was about 1.5 miles further up the river. After a good supper of venison steaks, thanks to Bradley's rifle, the group turned in for the night. Next day, Lacos and McPhail, attended by Horry and driving 2 extra horses, rode down to the Mormon Diggings for the purpose of getting up the provisions which they had left behind. Meantime, he walked out to reconnoiter their new quarters. He soon arrived at the mills and saw the spot where the discovery of the gold had first been made, by the torrent laying bare the sides of the mill race. There he met Mr. Marshall again. Of course, the operations of the sawmill had been stopped, for the workmen were employed in the vicinity, either above or below the works, digging and washing on their own account. Marshall paid the Indians he had at work chiefly in merchandise. He observed a portion of the gang, the men dressed for the most part in cotton drawers and moccasins, leaving the upper part of the body naked. They worked with the same implements as those used in the lower washings. Not far from the place where most of them were employed, he observed a number of the women and children pounding acorns in a hollow block of wood with an oblong stone. Of the acorn flour thus produced they made a sort of dry, hard, unpalatable bread, which assuredly none but an Indian stomach could digest. Upon instituting a more particular search into the nature of the country and their prospects, they discovered that the places where the gold was found in the greatest abundance and in the largest masses were the beds of the mountain torrents, now dry, which occasionally descend into both the forks of the stream. The group clambered up some of those precipitous ravines and observed, upon several occasions, as the group scrambled among the shingle, shining spangles of gold. The soil was evidently richly charged, but the great disadvantage was the comparative distance from water. In the evening, their friends arrived from the lower diggings, with the provisions all safe and sound, and the next day the group determined to set to work. In July 3rd, selecting a likely place in thought of a steep mountain gorge, the group transported thither the larger Indian baskets which they had purchased at Sutter's fort, and shoveling the earth into them, passed poles, cut from the nearest pine tree, through the rope handles they had affixed to these baskets. Resting the poles on their shoulders, the group carried the loaded baskets to the brink of the stream, and then set to work after the old fashion, with their hands in the baskets. Their success was great, and the day's return shows a decided improvement upon the Mormon diggings. The soil there is more richly impregnated with gold than below, but the labor of carrying the earth to the water is excessive, and he was so tired this evening that he very reluctantly opened his journal to make this short entry. In July 4th, as the group were starting off to the river with their first basket loads of gravel that morning, Lacos suddenly remarked that he did not see why the horses should be living like gentlemen when the gentlemen were working like horses, and he proposed to use the shoulders of their nags instead of their own for the conveyance of the earth. The group all fell in with this proposal, wondering it had never struck us before, and the horses were soon fetched from their comfortable quarters among the tall rank grass and set to work, with the baskets slung over their backs like panniers. Several newcomers from the Mormon Diggings passed us that day, bound further up the fork. In the morning, Mr. Marshall paid us a visit to know how the group were getting on. He had heard from Captain Sutter, who stated that he thought of starting for the upper or lower washings himself, as soon as he had gathered in his wheat harvest, which he hoped to accomplish during the present week. A number of wild ducks haunt the river, and especially abound in the grassy and weedy pools which skirt its edges. That morning the group shot some of these, and found them an agreeable addition to their dinner bill of fare. The afternoon has been passed among the greater part of the miners there as a celebration of the anniversary of American independence. Something like an outdoor feast was got up, and toasts were drunk and songs sang, Yankee Doodle and the Star-Spangled Banner being the chief favorites. Bradley made a smart speech, and contrary to his usual practice, complimented us Englishmen with a round of pleasant allusions to the mother country. Convinced us that much time and labor was lost in consequence of the distance between the digging the group worked at and the water, and the group therefore determined to seek a more desirable location. Ever since they had been at the sawmills, they had heard it constantly said that at Weber's Creek the gold was to be found in far greater abundance, and to Weber's Creek the group determined to go. The stream thus called is a small tributary to the northern fork of the Americans. The group struck their tents the previous day morning, loaded their horses, and took their departure. The river at the fording place was broad and rapid, but shallow. The principal difficulties in the ford arose from the number of smooth, round stones, covered with green rinsed slime, which formed the bed of the river, and over which their horses stumbled with a violence which threatened to disturb the fastening of their burdens. No disaster, however, actually occurred, except to poor Horry, whose horse stumbled over a large boulder and pitched its luckless rider over its head into the water, to the undissembled delight of the entire party, who hailed the poor sailor's discomfiture with loud bursts of laughter. Horry made the best of his way to the farther bank, without paying any more attention to his horse, which, however, emerged from the water and was on dry land as soon as Horry himself. The group now proceeded along the right bank of the North Fork, and on the opposite side the group caught a glimpse of a party of Indians at work, which the group afterwards learned were that of Mr. Sinclair. In 1 week this party had gathered 16 pounds troy of fine washed gold dust. They worked hard, were well fed, and had liberal rations of strong water daily. The group rested a couple of hours at noon in a pleasant bottom, heavily timbered, and afterwards, striking away from the river at an acute angle, moved leisurely on through a broken country, intersected by many watercourses, and overgrown with dense clusters of trees. During their afternoon march, the group passed several deserted Indian villages, the round-shaped skeletons of the huts alone remaining to mark the former settlements. Not a member of the tribe, however, was to be seen. The beaver may build and the deer pasture hereabouts in peace. Towards evening the group entered the valley drained by the stream called Weber's Creek. Its appearance was very beautiful, and the stream descended along a steep rocky bed, foaming round large boulder stones and tumbling down low ledges of granite. The grassy slopes of the valley are cut up in all directions with rivulets, the courses of which are marked by luxuriant underwood, rank grass, and groves of stunted oaks. 2 or 3 arbors were to be seen with 1 or 2 rude-looking tents, all with blazing fires before them. The group encamped forthwith, hoping the next day to reach a station which the group could make available for their purpose. The group were early on the move that morning, and soon saw several parties of 3s and 4s washing in the bed of the river, or exploring the mountain gorges with their shovels and mattocks. The weather was getting oppressively hot. Indeed, the further the group got from the Sacramento, the hotter did it become. The sea breeze never penetrates there to refresh us, and except when an occasional squall comes sweeping down from the hills, the air is very oppressive. The group traveled but slowly. Still in an hour or so the group reached a station, about 15 miles as the crow flies, or about 20 by the windings of the stream, from the point of its junction with the Americanos, where the group determined to try their luck. There was quite a camp there, not to the same extent as the Mormon Diggings, but still the washers were numerous, and the larger part of them were Indians. Some few worked in the bed of the river, but the great majority were engaged in the ravines leading up the mountains. The greatest quantity of gold dust was found in the former, while the latter yielded the best specimens of lump and scale gold. The group were told that, though the side gullies were very rich, yet they were more uncertain than the main stream. Lumps of gold, weighing several ounces, were continually met with, but a morning was often wasted and nothing found, whereas, if a man stuck to the main stream and washed all day long, he was sure of his ounce or couple of ounces of gold. For these reasons, the group determined to stand by the river. Their first business was to see if the group could manage to construct a couple of cradles. At a large store there, the group met with some pine planks, but the figure was most exorbitant. Taking a hint from what they had noticed among the Indians at the sawmills, the group determined to fell a couple of stout trees and hollow them out so as to serve their purpose. The group obtained the assistance of a man there, a ship's carpenter, and a most civil, obliging sort of fellow, who gave us a day's help for $30. He superintended the felling of the trees, and then put us in the way of proceeding with the work. They discovered the toil sufficiently severe, and began to feel Theat, as he thought, to a far greater extent than was the case in the lower part of the country. In July 8th, the previous day, the group were employed, from early in the morning till beyond noon, in trimming and hollowing out their cradles. While the group were seated together outside the tent, enjoying a few whiffs of their pipes and cigars, after a famous dinner of smoking hot steaks and frijoles, they witnessed the camp below was all in commotion. People were running out of their tents and shouting to their neighbors, and gradually a little crowd was formed round a group of horsemen, who were just then brought to a halt. That same feeling of curiosity which gets together a London crowd to see the lion on the top of Northumberland House wag his tail, caused us to make their way, with the rest of the gapers, down to Bennett's shanty, against which all this bustle appeared to be going on. As soon as Bradley and himself could force their way a little through the crowd, the group recognized in a moment the features of Colonel Mason. The colonel, who wore an undress military uniform, had just dismounted from his horse, with the intention, it appeared, of walking through the diggings. In a couple of minutes' time, his companion Lieutenant Sherman came up, and the group were soon engaged in an animated conversation in reference to the gold district. The fact was, the governor was on a tour of inspection for the purpose of making a report to the cabinet at Washington. He took care to thank Lieutenant Sherman for his letter of introduction to Captain Sutter, and to explain to him the friendly manner in which Captain Sutter received him. He then joined in the conversation being carried on with Colonel Mason, who was giving his opinion as to what the government would do with respect to the gold placer. The colonel was very guarded in his statements. He, however, hinted that he thought it would be politic for Congress to send over proper officers and workmen, and at once to establish a mint at some convenient point on the coast. He fully admitted the difficulties of keeping men to their engagements under circumstances like the present, but said some steps must be taken to check the system of desertions on the part of the troops quartered at Monterey and San Francisco. The pay of the soldiers, he considered, ought to be increased, but without reference to this, he told the gentlemen round him that, as good citizens, they were bound to lend their utmost endeavors to secure in safe custody all known deserters, men who had abandoned their flag and exposed the country to danger, that they might live in a state of drunkenness at the mines. Colonel Mason next proceeded to visit Captain Weber's store, whither Bradley accompanied him. On his return, Bradley informed us that the colonel and his escort intended to set off on their way back Low Sutter's fort that very afternoon, and they reckoned upon encamping some few miles below the sawmills that night. Bradley then took him aside and asked him whether this would not be a good opportunity to send their stock of gold dust down to Captain Sutter, who would, for a reasonable commission, consign it to a merchant at Monterey on their account. The weight of it was becoming cumbersome, and the group were besides in constant apprehension of some unfortunate accident happening to it. Now was the time, Bradley urged, to place all they had as yet realized in security. He knew Colonel Mason, in fact, had served under him, and undertook, if the remainder of the party were agreeable, to carry the gold under the protection of Colonel Mason's escort to Sutter's fort. There was something reasonable in this proposal, and Colonel Mason, on being appealed to, said he would gladly give Mr. Bradley such protection as his escort would afford him, and would be, moreover, happy of his company. The expedition was, therefore, summoned together, and the whole, or nearly so, of the gold dust being produced, it was weighed in their presence, and found to amount to 27 pounds 8 ounces troy, valued at over $4,600. Bradley gave a regular receipt for this to the company, and engaged to obtain a similar one from Captain Sutter. The gold dust was then packed in a small portmanteau, well secured by numerous cords, and firmly bound on the pack saddle of an extra horse, which Bradley was to ride alongside of, the bridle of the animal being secured to his arm, and its trail rope made fast to the saddle of the horse which Bradley himself rode. He was well armed with pistols and a rifle, and started with Colonel Mason's party a couple of hours before sundown, so that they might ford the river ere it was dusk. After accomplishing this, they intended to ride part of the way by the light of the moon. Delayed working until Monday. A few of the miners pursued their avocation on the Sunday, but the majority devoted the day to rest, smoking and sleeping in the shade alternately. He walked through the washings and heard that many of the miners had been taken ill with intermittent fever, a circumstance which did not astonish him. Bad diet, daily exposure to the sun while it was at its greatest height, followed by an exposure to the cold, damp air at night time. These conjoined were quite sufficient to bring on the most severe illness. On his return to the tent, he looked over their little stock of medicine, which he foresaw he should soon be required to use. On Monday, the group commenced operations in the old style, digging, fetching water, and rocking the cradle. The sun came blazing down with great power, causing headaches to most of the party, particularly Malcolm, who complained much. The day's taking was very good, the group having realized 9 ounces with one machine and 7.5 with the other. At night, as Malcolm still continued to complain of his head, and as there was evidently a good deal of low fever about him, he gave him a dose of calomel and a febrifuge mixture, which by the morning produced a good deal of relief. Bradley made his appearance during the forenoon, after a fatiguing ride from Sutter's fort. He had seen the captain, had delivered the gold, and settled the transaction. The group were hard at work the whole of that day. In the evening, a man came crawling into the tent to know if they had any medicines the group would sell. He told him Brooks was a doctor and asked him what was the matter. He had been suffering from remittent fever of a low typhoid type. He gave him bark and told him he must lay up and take care of himself. He said he would, but next day, during the intervals of fever, he observed him working away with his pan. The news of there being a doctor in the camp soon spread, and he was now being continually called on to prescribe for a large number of patients. An ounce of gold is the fee generally given him. This sort of work is as much more profitable as it was less laborious than working at the cradle. But the great drawback is that one has to do something else beyond advising. People require physicking, and as he cannot submit to be deprived of the little stock of medicine he had brought with him in case of his own friends having occasion for it, he was obliged to give over practicing in those cases where medicine is absolutely necessary. The native Californians, both Indians and whites, have an universal remedy for febrile affections, and indeed for sickness of almost any kind. This is the temazcal, a sort of hot air bath, shaped not unlike a sentry box and built of wickerwork, and afterwards plastered with mud until it becomes airtight. There is one of these machines at the Weber Creek washings, which has been run up by the Indians during the last few days. One of them used it for the first time this afternoon, and to his surprise is still alive. After a great fire had been made up close to the door, a narrow aperture just large enough for a little man to squeeze through, it was afterwards gradually allowed to burn itself out, having in the meantime heated to a very high degree the air in the interior of the bath. Into this, the Indian screwed himself, and there remained until a profuse perspiration was produced, which he checked forthwith by a plunge into the chilly water of the river. There he floundered about for a few minutes, and then crawled out and lay down exhausted on the ground. The atmosphere continues exceedingly sultry, and the miners who work by the river out of the shade have in several instances sunk exhausted under the toil. Dysentery, produced probably by unwholesome food, has also begun to show itself, and altogether the aspect of things is anything but cheerful. In July 15th, Saturday, the group have engaged a large party of Indians to work for us in the ravines. They belong to the Snake tribe and appear to be a poor set of half-starved wretches. The group pay them in provisions and occasionally drams of pisco, a spirit made from Californian grapes. On visiting the encampment of their Indians last night after work was over, he found about a dozen of them eagerly engaged gambling away, the stake, in some instances, being the supper which had just been served out to them, with an ardor equal to that of the most civilized gamesters. So far as he could make out, the game had some analogy to their thimble rigging, but appeared to be fairly played. A small ball was passed by 3 of the Indians from hand to hand, with such rapid dexterity that no eye could keep pace with their movements. 3 others watched it with peculiar eagerness. Every now and then the latter made a correct guess, and one was scored in their favor. If wrong, a mark was scored against them. The Indians are in general strongly addicted to games of chance, and they sometimes gamble away all the clothing on their backs. Heard of an instance which occurred near the sawmills, of an Indian who, after having lost every article of clothing he had, one after the other to his more fortunate antagonist, staked his labor for a week against the cotton shirt which he had lost only a few minutes before. He had a run of misfortune, and when he left off, had to work for 6 weeks at gold washing for his antagonist, who fed him on nothing better than acorn bread. Nellig, who told him of this circumstance, had seen the man at work duly fulfilling his engagement. The sickness amongst the miners continues to increase, and in their own party Lacos has been laid up for 2 days with fever. However, he thinks he is now doing well. The climate does not appear to be unhealthy. It was the exposure to the work which does the mischief. There is some talk afloat among the expedition of removing further up the country, nearer to the mountains, where gold is said to be in greater abundance. The previous day, a large party, many of them Mormons, started for the Bear River, a small stream which runs into the Sacramento and is said to be about 50 miles distant, due north from where the group are encamped. The Indians at work there have caused the price of pisco and whiskey to rise to a most exorbitantly high rate. They content themselves with feasting on the bitter acorn bread and spend all their earnings on strong water and a little finery. Sometimes a party of them, when intoxicated, will get up one of their wild dances, when the stamping and yelling are of a far more fearful character than is generally the case at these singular exhibitions. The dance begins generally with a rude song, the words being of the usual harsh guttural character, but the ideas are generally striking and peculiar. One has been explained to him which recites the praises of the yellow earth, because it will procure the Shoshone the fleet rifle with which he can slay his Pawnee foe. It says nothing, however, about the strong water, which renders the arm of the war chief weaker than that of a child. For, with all their vices, there is still that pride about the Indian character which makes them ashamed of those weaknesses they are unable to resist. Frequently, while the Indian warriors repose from their exertions, after the termination of one of these wild dances, the women of the tribe will occupy their place, but in general their postures and movements are indelicate in the extreme. But modesty is hardly to be looked for in the amusements of savage life. Worked hard last week, but suffered greatly from theat. Almost every man of us complains of feverish symptoms, with pains in the limbs, back, and loins, yet the group are better than the majority of the miners. These washings have now become nearly as crowded as the Mormon Diggings were when the group left them, and immense sums have been made by some of the luckier adventurers amongst the ravines. The whole valley is dotted over with tents and green bush arbors, and there is hardly a watercourse but which is sprinkled with miners, digging, sifting, and washing. About half of the people work together in companies. The other half shift each for himself. There are hundreds of Indians, many of them fantastically dressed, for they can purchase fine clothing now, even at the extravagant rates at which all articles are charged at Weber's store. They labor one day and get drunk on pisco or the strong water on another. One of them rolled down a rocky ravine lately, in an intoxicated state, and was killed. As the group were lying down in the shade of the tent the previous day, the group were visited by an old trapper called Joe White. He had recognized Bradley and Don Lewis, whom he had met on the coast, and the group invited him to take coffee with us. Joe White had come into this part of the country with Captain Sutter, whom he spoke very highly of, and of whose early efforts to form a settlement he gave us an account. Their party was the very first of the white settlers in the wilderness. They lived some time in a camp formed of the tented wagons they had brought with them, until they could run up a few rough shanties and some protecting outworks. During the time they were constructing these, and indeed for some months afterwards, they were dreadfully harassed by the Indians, who made onslaughts on their cattle, carried away, killed, and eat both horses and oxen. The Indians are by no means particular. One night, after the party had been lulled into a sense of security by the apparent friendly disposition of the Indians, who occasionally came into their camp, and no watch was being kept, upwards of a score of horses and mules were driven off, the loss of which Sutter's people knew nothing of until they woke up in the morning and found the ropes all cut. They started off at once on the trail and soon found that it led to an Indian rancheria, about 8 miles up the Sacramento. This rancheria was, they believed, the refuge of the Injun varmints, as Joe while styled them, from whose depredations they were constantly suffering. Captain Sutter determined to take signal revenge. They returned to the fort that day, but next morning started off in a strong party, each man armed with his never-failing rifle and big Bowie knife, and taking with them a howitzer which the captain had brought with him over the Rocky Mountains. The Indians must, however, have had information by their scouts of the expedition, for when the party reached the rancheria, they found it deserted, not even a solitary squaw left among the huddled-up collection of huts. Determined not to be foiled, the party set to work to demolish the village. The construction of the Indian houses rendered this an easy task, but to complete it, fire was requisite. No sooner had the smoke risen from the kindling wood than their ears were saluted with a dismal yell from a little densely wooded island a couple of 100 yards up the stream. Starting out in all directions from the high grass and underwood, appeared a crowd of squaws with their children, who gave whoop after whoop, and, brandishing boughs of trees, imprecated curses upon the destroyers of their rancheria. Captain Sutter and his party of trappers were somewhat startled at this proceeding, and the question immediately occurred to them as to where the men could be. The party pushed their way homewards as fast as possible, leaving the rancheria burning and the squaws and children still yelling and whooping on the island. It was as they expected. On coming within 2 miles of the fort, they heard the crack upon crack of distant rifles. Putting their horses to the gallop, they arrived just in time to see the Indians totally routed and scampering away as fast as their horses would carry them into the woods. After this double defeat, the tribe seemed to have given up all idea of prosecuting a war against their new neighbors, and gradually relinquishing their thievish habits, settled in the neighborhood of the fort, sometimes hunting and trapping for the pale faces, and at others laboring away at ditching and brick-making, being paid chiefly in articles of clothing and small allowances of pisco. The trapper told us that Captain Sutter has now a tin coin in circulation, stamped with his name, and good for a certain amount of merchandise at the fort. After listening to a few more wonderful adventures of this sort, Bradley turned the conversation upon the country about Bear River. The trapper said he knew it well and had heard that there was plenty of gold there. He asked him if he would undertake to guide us thither, and after some bargaining, he consented. The sum he was to have was $65 and his food. Considering the high rates of all things there, this was a low figure enough, but the old trapper candidly told us that he was sick and tired of paddling about in the water washing for gold, and that he would prefer a few days' jaunt in the wilderness. The climate was much cooler further to the north, he informed us, and comparatively few miners had penetrated to the Bear Valley. They had a long debate upon the matter, and ultimately it was determined to start the day after tomorrow, Wednesday. In July 25th, Tuesday, this day has been devoted to preparations for their journey. Their stock of provisions, with the exception of breadstuffs, is quite exhausted. The group have had, therefore, to lay in a stock, but they discovered everything, of course, inordinately dear. So the group have contented ourselves with buying some bacon and dried beef and coffee, resolving to trust to their rifles for further support, there being plenty of game in the neighborhood of the Bear Valley. By the advice of Joe White, the group intend not only to load the pack horses with a portion of their stock of provisions, but each man is to take a fortnight's rations for himself. The pack horses will carry about another fortnight's supply. The group should have preferred, if the group could have managed it, to dispatch the gold the group have amassed since Bradley's mission to Captain Sutter down to the fort. But after some deliberation, the group have resolved not to risk its transit without an escort, and accordingly have agreed to load one horse, the most sure-footed of the lot, with the valuable burden, and to attach its trail ropes to the horses ridden by ourselves in turn. This evening 3 men, hearing of their intended expedition, offered to join the party. These were Edward Story, an American lawyer, who had been one of the inferior alcaldes during the Spanish regime at Monterey; John Dowling, first male, and Samuel Bradshaw, the carpenter, of an American whaling ship which they had left at San Francisco. The lawyer was an intelligent person, conversant with the language of several of the tribes. The mate seemed to have his wits about him, and the carpenter would obviously be a great acquisition, particularly as the group were now about to plunge even beyond the furthest outposts of civilization, where, in all probability, the group may have to secure ourselves against attacks from the Indians, without the possibility of any help beyond that which the group could render to each other. The group were rather pleased with their offer, and received them as an addition to the expedition. All 3 had horses, although, as usual with seamen, the mate and carpenter were terribly awkward equestrians. Wednesday, in July 26th. This day the group struck their camp before sunrise, and had the horses securely packed and all in motion in the early cool of the morning. The march was a fatiguing one, the country appearing to be a succession of woody bottoms, or valleys and steep rocky ridges, which tried the mettle of their loaded horses severely. From the summit of one of the hills more elevated than the rest, the group obtained a distant view of the valley of the Sacramento. Their general course was north-northwest. The trapper, who proved an able guide, varied the direction from time to time so as to lead us through the easiest paths, taking care to steer clear of the deep canyons that split up the hills in every direction. The group dined at noon as usual, and that very well, on some hare soup made from a couple of hares which they had shot during the morning, and some dried beef. The signs of deer were very frequent. After mounting and descending a very precipitous and rocky ridge, the group encamped near some waterfalls in a wide open valley. The night was somewhat cold, and the group enjoyed a blazing fire of pine sticks, which the group cut from the dried trees in the vicinity. Friday, in July 28th. The previous day morning dawned clear and rather coolish. In the forenoon, the group crossed the North Fork of the Americanos, which was there but a trifling stream. The general character of the country was becoming more and more mountainous and difficult to traverse, and they discovered the labor of the journey sufficiently severe. A great number of watercourses crossed their path, but the channels were quite dry, the stones and shingle white and bleaching in the sun. An unfortunate accident occurred during the afternoon's march to one of the pack horses, which stumbled over a heap of rough stones in clambering up from the bed of a torrent and broke its leg. They had to shoot the poor animal to put it out of pain. Its burden was equally distributed between its more fortunate fellows. The group encamped amongst rocks and had a poor supper of flour cakes and bacon scraps. During the night, Don Lewis was attacked with ague-ish symptoms. He prescribed bark, which appeared to relieve him. That day their horses were quickly saddled and packed, and the group started off in the faint gray of the morning. It was chilly, but the sky was beautifully clear. When the sun had fairly risen, however, they had no more cold to complain of. The way was exceedingly difficult. The group toiled along precipitous ravines and gullies and climbed up steep and rocky ridges, which cut and wounded the feet of the horses and rendered their progress very slow. The timber the group passed was principally pine trees, with sharp pointed leaves and large cones, and occasionally the group came upon a grove of evergreen oaks, more stunted in shape than was the case in the lower regions. About midday the group passed the source of the Rio de las Plumas, or Feather River, and after a most severe and in some respects forced march, climbed the last rocky ridge which separated us from the Bear Valley. The sun was near its setting as the group pushed down the mountain slopes towards the river. They discovered it, a small stream flowing swiftly over a shingly bed to the westward, and encamped within hearing of its murmur, well pleased to have performed their toilsome journey. Make up for the fatigues of the journey from Weber's Creek. On surveying the country, they discovered ourselves in a perfect solitude. Not an Indian, far less a white man, was to be seen. The fertile valley of the Bear River, with its luxuriant grass, in which nestled coveys of the Californian quail, seemed almost untrodden by human foot, and sloped in great beauty between the ridges of rocky hills and peaks of granite, with dark ravines and canyons between, which hemmed it in. Their first care was, of course, to try the capabilities of the country in the way of gold. The group therefore separated ourselves and sought different points of the channel of the stream and different chasms, which in the winter time conducted the mountain torrents into it. To their great astonishment and disappointment, one by one the group returned into the camp with the news of their non-success. By the old trapper's advice, an exploring party was dispatched to follow up the stream towards its head. They traveled the distance of some 10 or 12 miles, crossing some of the more important tributaries of the main river, and had the good fortune to strike upon a spot where a slight examination was sufficient to prove that the gold existed in great abundance in the sand and shingles, and embedded in flakes amid the rocks. That day the group have moved the camp to this spot, and as the group are now beyond the reach of aid from white men, and have begun to feel that the group must be, for some time at least, a self-supporting party, their first thoughts are turned towards making arrangements for obtaining a supply of food and for ensuring their security. Bradley, Joe White, and Jose are to be their hunters. Malcolm, Lacos, and McPhail are to set to work the following day to make a couple of cradles, the carpenter giving them an occasional helping hand, but occupying himself principally in superintending the construction of a large shanty, sufficient to accommodate the whole party, with a rough fortification around, composed of pine logs and palisades, pointed at the top, sufficient to enclose a space of ground into which the horses could be driven at night, out of the way of any outlying Indian who might be thievishly inclined. The group calculate that the construction of the shanty, with its appurtenances, will occupy at least a week, in all probability much longer. Malcolm, McPhail, and Lacos are to join us in their labors as soon as they have finished the cradles. The hunters had good luck that day and came in with a couple of fat bucks. The trapper had also snared a number of quails so that their table was nobly furnished. Their dinner also included a dessert of a fruit similar to apples in taste, but not larger than well-grown gooseberries. These had been gathered and brought in by the trapper in the morning. Sunday, August 6th. He had felt very low-spirited these last few days. One's thoughts have turned towards home, and an indescribable sensation of melancholy has been weighing him down, which at last his companions have begun to take notice of. This evening, just as the remainder of the party contemplated turning in for the night, he pulled out his notebook and began writing beside the campfire. "No Pud VM. Dormir," said Don Luis to him as he moved away towards the tent. "No, Senor," replied he. "Pienso a la vella ingledera, a mi hermana y a mis amigos. Por ventura a una amiguita," observed Don Luis. He laughed and answering, "Es possible, Senor," went on writing. "The group are now regularly settled on the Bear River and have as yet seen no signs of human life round about us. The reports, therefore, which the group heard at Weber's Creek of the gold finders having penetrated into this valley would appear to have been without foundation. The group have observed a fresh-made trail, which the old trapper seems to consider passes in the direction of the Truckee Lake, and the group have noticed the remains of several campfires at different parts of the valley. In all probability, this trail has been made by the Mormon immigrants, who are reported to have gone on a gold hunting expedition across the Salt Desert to the shores of the Great Salt Lake, a distance of 700 or 800 miles. The old trapper had some wonderful stories to tell about the dangers of the journey across the salt plain. How that a man has to travel, from the first faint break of gray light in the morning, as hard as his horse will carry him, over a desert of white salt, which crunches and crumbles beneath his horse's tread at every step he takes, until the sun has gone down behind the tall peaks of the distant Sierra Nevada. No water but of the most brackish kind can be procured to refresh either horse or rider through the whole of this weary route, while their lips are parched with thirst, and their eyes and nostrils become choked from the effects of the saline exhalations, rising up on all sides from the desert over which they are passing. And as for the Great Salt Lake, the desolate shores of this inland sea have been, for the most part, carefully avoided by both Indians and trappers, and no living being has yet been found daring enough to venture far on the bosom of its dark, turbid waters, for a belief exists that a terrible whirlpool agitates their surface, ready to swallow up everything that may venture within the bounds of its dangerous influence. Their cradles were finished on Monday, and the shanty on Saturday afternoon. It includes a sort of outhouse for cooking, and the rude palisades around are quite sufficient protection for the horses against any attempts the Indians are likely to make to drive them off. As soon as their building labors were over the previous day, the group set to work digging and washing, and were very successful. The country about there is of course much more rugged than in the lower diggings. Grass is plentiful in the valley, but the rocky heights are covered with a stinted vegetation, offering no food to their horses. The soil, mineralogically considered, does not seem to vary materially from that in the neighborhood of Weber's Creek. If anything, it was more impregnated with gold. On Friday, Don Luis discovered a large rough lump in a cannon about a mile from the shanty, and the next evening a similar lump, though rather smaller, was picked up by Bradley in one of his hunting excursions. August 8th. The group have engaged the services of their friend the trapper at the rate of $15 a week, with an allowance of whiskey twice a day. He will hunt for us, but will have nothing to do with gold digging and washing. He has a tolerable contempt for dollars, or else he would have demanded higher wages. A man who has spent nearly all his life in the wilderness, who has known no wants but such as his rifle could quickly supply, may, however, well look with contempt on the root of all evil. If he were hungry, a shot at some panting elk or bellowing buffalo would stock him with food for weeks to come. If he were athirst, the clear water of some sparkling rivulet would yield him all that he would require. The hide of the bear or of the buffalo would serve to clothe him and to shelter him from the sharp night frosts, while a score of beaver skins would purchase him ammunition more than sufficient to last him all the year round. What, then, should he want with gold? The previous day, while the group were at dinner, the group were surprised by seeing a party of Indians approaching the camp from the direction of Truckee Lake. They appeared not to have any hostile intentions, so the group quietly awaited their approach. The foremost chief held before him a long stick with a bunch of white feathers dangling at the end. Story explained to us that this was a friendly sign and said they had nothing to fear from the party. As they approached nearer towards us, they commenced dancing and singing, and the group could soon perceive that very few among them were armed, and that altogether their appearance was anything but warlike and imposing. Story went out to meet them and shook hands with the few foremost chiefs. When they reached the shanty, before the door of which the group were seated, the chiefs gathered on the right-hand side of us and squatted themselves down upon the ground, when the pipe of peace was immediately produced by a veteran chief and hemmed round. He took a few whiffs with the rest, and then the group learnt from their visitors that they were anxious to engage in a trade. All that they had, however, were some few esculent roots and several bags of pine nuts. These last they roast and eat, but the taste is far from pleasant. In exchange for them, they wanted some charges of powder and ball. 3 of them, he noticed, possessed old Spanish muskets, of which they seemed particularly proud. They held them in the usual cautious Indian style, with the butt end clutched in the right hand and the barrel resting on the left arm. A few of the others had bows and arrows slung across their backs. The group pleaded shortness of ammunition as their excuse for declining the trade. Their provisions being run low made it impossible for us to offer them anything to eat, so the group gave them a few blankets, which the group could well spare, by way of keeping ourselves in their good graces, as, according to Story, they would have considered it a great affront if they had neglected to make them any presents. The Indians remained and encamped outside their fort. Last night and that morning the greater part took their departure. The guard last night had orders to keep a sharp lookout, as the group thought that their friends, even though they had no hostile intentions towards us, might still take a strong liking to some of their horses, but nothing of a suspicious character occurred. 5 young men of the tribe also have stopped behind, who wish to continue with us and work for us, but the low state of their commissarial renders it desirable not to accept their offer, unless their hunters return that day with a good stock of provisions. August 13th. Their hunters have been very successful these last few days. The group have a large stock of elk meat, which the group intend drying after the Indian fashion. On Friday, while Don Lewis and the trapper were out together, they were surprised by the sight of a huge bear right before them, slowly walking up towards them. As soon as he arrived within about 100 paces, he squatted down upon his haunches for a few moments. But as they got nearer to him, and just as they were preparing to give him a greeting in the shape of a couple of balls through his head, he rose up and scampered off. They fired, but without success, and the brute plunged into a dense thicket, after which they saw nothing more of him. Their Indians, after stopping with us a couple of days, during which period the group compelled them to encamp at night time outside the fort, took their departure early on Friday morning, or else during the night of Thursday, unperceived by their sentinels. They, however, took nothing with them belonging to the expedition, except a couple of blankets they had lent to the 2 principal men. On Friday, while several of us were rambling about the neighborhood of the camp, exploring the numerous mountain canyons which lie between us and the Sierra Nevada, they discovered, among the loose particles of rock which had crumbled away from the sides of the ravine and fallen to the bottom, several lumps of gold of a much larger size than any they had before met with. This induced us to examine the upper part of the ravine, where promising traces of gold were readily detected. Further examination convinced us that the precious metal existed there in far greater quantities than in the locality where they had been at work for several weeks previous, and the group were, moreover, satisfied that it was to be obtained with much less difficulty. as, being found in solid lumps, the unpleasant labor of washing was dispensed with. The group therefore determined, on the following morning, to remove all their implements to this spot, the only disadvantage of which was its being situated rather far off from their place of encampment. Since their friends, the Indians, had quitted us, they had always left someone or other on guard at the shanty to keep watch over their horses and baggage, both during the daytime and at night, for the group knew that some of them were continually prowling about, their horses having frequently shown signs of uneasiness in the night time. During the day, there was generally one member of the party who remained at the shanty, having either Jose or the lad Horry in company. The ravine the group proposed moving to was nearly half a mile distant. After breakfast, Bradley, Lacos, and McPhail, accompanied by the old trapper, set off on a hunting expedition, for their stock of provisions was now getting very low, leaving Jose and their legal friend at the camp. The remainder of the party, including himself, proceeded to the ravine with their implements, and after working a few hours, the group succeeded in procuring more gold than they had obtained in any 2 days during the past week. The group were just on the point of returning to the camp to dinner when Dowling, who was standing near some sage bushes at the upper part of the ravine, heard a rustling among them, and on moving in the direction of the noise saw an Indian stealthily creeping along, who, as soon as he perceived he was discovered, discharged an arrow, which just missed its mark, but lacerated, and that rather severely, Dowling's ear. The savage immediately set up a most terrific whoop and ran off, but stumbled before he could draw another arrow from his quiver, while Dowling, rushing forward, buried his mattock in the head of his fallen foe, killing him instantaneously. At this moment the group heard the crack of a rifle in the direction of the camp, which, with the Indian's whoop at the same moment, completely bewildered us. Every man, however, seized his rifle, and Dowling, hastening towards us, told us what had just occurred. All was still for the next few moments, and he mounted a little hill to reconnoiter. Suddenly he observed a troop of Indians, the foremost of them on horseback, approaching at full speed. He hastily returned to his companions, and the group sought shelter in a little dell, determined to await there and resist the attack, for it was evident that the savages' intentions were anything but pacific. It was a moment of breathless excitement. The group heard the tramp of the horses coming on towards us, but as yet they and their riders were concealed from their view. He confessed he trembled violently, not exactly with fear, although he expected that a few moments would see us all scalped by their savage assailants. It was the suddenness of the danger which startled him and made his heart throb violently. But at that moment, just as Brooks was reproaching himself with the want of courage, a terrific yell rung through the air at a short distance from us, and 40 or 50 warlike Indians appeared in sight. His whole frame was nerved in an instant, and when a shower of arrows flew amongst us, Brooks was the first man to answer it with a rifle shot, which brought one of the foremost Indians off his horse to the ground. He instantly reloaded, but in the meanwhile the rifles of his companions had been doing good service. They had taken up their position behind a row of willow trees which skirted the banks of a narrow stream, and there the group were protected in a great measure from the arrows of their assailants, which were in most cases turned aside by the branches. A second volley of rifle shots soon followed the first, and while the group were reloading and the smoke had slightly cleared away, he could see that they had spread consternation in the ranks of the Indian warriors, and that they were gathering up their wounded preparatory to retreating. He had his eye on one old man who had just leapt from his horse. His finger was on the trigger when he observed him coolly advance, and taking one of his wounded companions who had been shot through the leg in his arms, place him on a horse, then mounting his own, and catching hold of the other animal's bridle, gallop off at full speed. Although he knew full well that if the fortune of the day had gone against us, these savages would not have spared a single man of the expedition, still he could not find it in his heart to fire on the old chief, and he therefore carried off his wounded comrade in safety. In a few minutes the hillsides were clear, and when the group emerged from their shelter, all that was visible of the troop of warriors was 3 of them weltering in their blood, a bow or 2 and some empty quivers, and a few scattered feathers and tomahawks lying on the ground. One by one, the group gradually stole up to the top of the mound from whence he first beheld the approach of the enemy, when, finding that they were retreating at full speed in an opposite direction to the camp, the group determined to proceed thither at once, fully prepared to find both Story and Jose murdered. On their arrival, however, the former coolly advanced to meet us, and in answer to their questions, stated that while he was superintending the proper browning of their venison, and Jose was filling the cans with water, he saw several of their horses scampering off, being in fact driven by 3 or 4 Indians on horseback. So quickly, said he, was the movement effected that before he could lay hold of his rifle they were nearly beyond range. He fired, but without effect, and while Brooks was looking about, he supposed in rather a bewildered manner, a party of something like 40 Indians ran rapidly past. He don't know whether they saw him or not, but Brooks was by no means anxious to engage their attention, and was glad enough when the last passed out of sight. He then went in search of Jose, whom he found in the river up to his neck in water, a position which he thought afforded the safest means of concealment, as he knew his wild brethren would have sacrificed him, and perhaps eaten him forthwith, if they had chanced to discover him. He at once set to work to dress Dowling's ear, and a wound which Don Lewis had received in his hand. The latter was merely a scratch, and the only danger likely to arise from it was in the event of the arrow by which it was inflicted having been poisoned. But Don Lewis felt so confident that this was not the practice among the tribes about there, that he would not allow him to take the usual precautions against such a contingency. Their anxiety was now turned towards the party who were out hunting, and the group anxiously looked for their appearance. They had been so upset by the events of the morning that the group all felt disinclined to resume their labors after their meal was concluded, and the group occupied ourselves in and about the camp, and in discussing the reason of the Indians' attack and the probability of its being followed up by another. The day wore on without any signs of their companions' return. Towards evening, a rifle was fired off occasionally, to let them know of the danger which in all probability awaited them from an attack on the part of the Indians, and also to let the latter gentry know that the group were on the lookout. It was arranged that the group should all keep watch until the arrival of their friends, to be the better prepared for any danger which menaced us and them, for the group thought it not unlikely that the Indians were hovering about the camp and might attempt a surprise. Exhausted, however, by excitement and fatigue, one by one the group dropped off to sleep. Brooks was wakened up by the report, as he thought, of a rifle, which was immediately followed by a horrible moaning, and the whole of us were soon on their legs, rifles in hand, in the expectation of being butchered in the course of a few minutes. Bradley's well-known whistle, however, somewhat restored their confidence. In a few minutes Lacos, Bradley, and the old trapper were by the campfire. "Is MacPhail there?" asked all of them in a breath, anxiously looking round the circle. The reply to the question was a sad one. He had not yet returned. In answer to their inquiries as to where they had parted from him, and as to whether they had heard the rifle shot which had disturbed us from their sleep, Lacos replied that they had first missed him about 3/4 of an hour ago, but they did not feel any particular uneasiness at the circumstance, as they imagined he had ridden on first. The night was rather dark, but Lacos said the trail could easily be distinguished. With regard to the shot they had heard fired, and the moans which followed it, Bradley said that shortly after missing MacPhail, they found some wolves were on their track, in all likelihood scenting the deer which they were carrying slung across their horses. Fearing their noise might attract a more dangerous customer, in the shape of a puma, towards them, he fired a couple of pistols, which had the effect of wounding 2 of the pack, who rolled over with terrific howls. It must have been Bradley's last shot that woke us, for none of us heard more than one shot fired. Their 3 huntsmen set about preparing their supper immediately, in the full expectation that MacPhail would make his appearance before the venison was ready. The supper was, however, cooked and eaten, but still no MacPhail arrived. Another hour was suffered to elapse, and then the group began to consider that it was nearly 3 hours ago since he was last seen, while at that time he was not more than 1 hour's distance from the camp. It was evident, therefore, that he had either missed the trail or followed it in the opposite direction, which last was the old trapper's opinion, or else some more serious misfortune had happened to him. The group at once resolved to set out in search of him, leaving a guard behind at the camp. The mate and Don Lewis, being both, as it were, invalided, were of course among those who were to remain. Bradley pleaded fatigue and wished to stay in camp, and Biggs was left on guard with him. It must have been about 1 o'clock when the group started, and after half an hour's hard riding, the group came upon the spot where MacPhail had last been seen. The group shouted for some time as loudly as their lungs would let us, but heard nothing, save the howl of some hungry wolf in reply. The group then followed the trail at a brisk pace for 8 or 9 miles, but could discover nothing of their missing friend. There seemed no possibility of ascertaining whether he had proceeded in the direction in question or not, as the marks made by the horses of the party in the morning, on their way out, somewhat confused the old trapper. His keen eye, however, soon detected marks of a horse's hoof in a contrary direction, over the marks which the horses of the hunting party had made on their return. These signs were not apparent beyond the spot they had reached. In which direction they were continued, the night was too dark to discover. Feeling that further search before daybreak would be useless, the group resolved to get a few hours' sleep in the meantime, and dismounting from their horses, secured them as well as the group could, and placing their saddles on the ground to serve as pillows, the group wrapped their saddle cloths round us, and were soon fast asleep. Story and the lad Horry did first duty as sentinels. While they were on guard, Brooks was wakened by a sharp tug at his leg, and while Brooks was seizing hold of his rifle, he recognized Story's voice calling him by name. He told him that, after keeping a sharp lookout for about half an hour, he observed several fires on the hillsides, apparently about half a mile off. He had been watching them for some time, and at last determined to wake one of the party. He proceeded with him outside the little willow copse where they had fixed ourselves, and true enough there were the fires, belonging, as the group thought, to a camp of Indians, very likely the same who had stolen their horses and attacked us in the morning. The group returned and woke the whole party, and a consultation being held, it was decided, as the group were well armed, and as the Indians had shown so much anxiety that morning to get beyond reach of their weapons, after tasting a few shots, to effect a surprise and recover, if possible, their stolen horses. The group saddled and mounted as quickly as possible, and after riding about a mile in the direction of the fires, found that the group were getting tolerably close to their enemies. On the party traveled, taking every bush which crackled beneath their horses' tread for a token of the movements of some Indian scout who had scented their approach. When within a short distance of the campfires, the group dismounted and tied their horses to some trees, leaving them in charge of the lad Horry, with directions for him to keep his ears well open, and, in the event of his hearing us retreat from the Indians, to give a few lusty shouts, so as to let us know where the means of flight were to be found. The group advanced cautiously, Malcolm and Bradshaw preceding the main body, about 20 paces apart. The arrangement was for the 5, namely, Lacas, Story, the trapper, Jose, and himself, who composed the main body, to form a semicircle of which the 2 scouts would compose the extreme points, and so to approach the Indians' camp, on nearing which the group were to fire a volley on them from their rifles, and wheeling round, drive their horses off and retreat. The group were within 200 paces of the campfires when the group were startled by the report of a rifle. A shrill whistle followed, but the group still advanced, and in a few moments came up with Malcolm and Bradshaw, the sailor being supported in the arms of his companion, who called out that the man was shot and begged him to look to him. The remainder of the party, hearing this, moved a few paces forward, leveled their rifles, and were on the eve of firing when the group were suddenly saluted in true British vernacular with an exclamation of "D, your eyes, who goes there?" This so startled the expedition that it saved the lives, very probably, of the whole camp. They halted for a moment and consulted together as to the course to be adopted. A shot had been fired from the camp, and one of their men injured. They therefore concluded that they had stumbled on the camp of one of those gangs of ruffians which were known to infest the hills at the foot of the Sierra Nevada. At this juncture, he ran up to the group with the intelligence that Bradshaw had been injured by a shot from his own rifle, which had accidentally gone off, and which circumstance Malcolm had not, in the first instance, explained. He told his companions that the man was seriously wounded in the leg, that he had merely bandaged it up with a handkerchief, and leaving him in Malcolm's charge, had hastened forward to let them know the fact, that no more blood might be shed. No sooner was this explanation given than the group heard a loud shout from the lad Horry, followed, as he thought, by some faint groans. But none of the others heard them, and he thought he might have been mistaken. It was concluded that he was merely shouting in accordance with their instructions, and no further notice was taken of the affair. At that instant several horses came galloping by at full speed, passing within a few yards of us, and following them, the group could discern half a dozen mounted Indians. The group guessed the truth at once. They had cut the bridles of their horses and were driving them away to rejoin their fellows, which had been stolen from us in the morning. The group leveled their rifles and fired, reloaded and fired again. And then, in the midst of a chorus of hallooing and screaming from the camp just before us, and the loud bellowing of the retreating Indians, started off in pursuit, and soon succeeded in turning their animals round, the Indians vanishing as rapidly as they had appeared. Securing their steeds, the group walked them back in the direction of the spot where they had left Horry, and after some trouble succeeded in finding the exact place, when to their horror, they discovered the poor fellow quite dead, his body covered with blood, and his head and face dreadfully disfigured. A closer examination showed us that the poor lad, after being murdered, had been scalped by the savages. "Yes, yes," said the old trapper. "Sure enough his scalp is dangling in the belt of one of them devils. He'll send an ounce of lead through the first redskin he meet outside them clearings. The group'll have vengeance, the group will." As soon as Brooks was a little recovered from the horror which this scene naturally caused, he returned with the old trapper to the spot where he had left Malcolm and Bradshaw, hardly expecting, after what he had just witnessed, to find either of them alive. Brooks was, however, happy in his fears not being realized. They were both as he had left them. The group carried the wounded man, as well as the group could between us, back to the place where the remainder of the party were waiting for us. There the group stayed till daybreak, silent and dejected. For his own part he could have wept. That rough sailor lad, though under other circumstances he might have looked down on him with contempt, and not have cared one straw whether he was dead or alive, had been one of a little society, every member of which had grown upon him in the rude life they had lived together in this wilderness, and Brooks felt that he had lost a friend. The day broke at last, and after repairing their bridles as well as the group could, the group prepared to depart. The group wrapped the body of the dead lad in a blanket and laid it over the back of his horse to convey it to their camp, where the group might bury it according to the rites of the English Church. He examined the carpenter's leg and found his hurt was, fortunately, only a flesh wound. It gave him, nevertheless, great pain to travel on horseback, but there was no other means of conveying him to the camp. As the group rode slowly along, in the gray light of the morning, the group caught sight of the valley, the scene of their last night's misfortunes, and saw on the hillsides two white-tinted emigrant wagons, with the horses quietly grazing down in the bottom. Several of us rode towards the spot, but found not a soul there. One of last night's mysteries was explained. The camp they had at first taken to be an Indian one, and then one of mountain robbers, was merely that of a few emigrants, who, having crossed the pass in the Sierra Nevada, were doubtless on their way to the Sacramento Valley. In all probability, alarmed by the extraordinary affair of last night, they had abandoned their wagons and sought concealment from the dangers which they imagined surrounded them. The group shouted out the words "friends," "Americans," and other expressions to give them confidence if they were within hearing, but the group obtained no reply. The group, therefore, hastened to rejoin the remainder of the expedition, and in about 3 hours' tune the group reached the camp, cheering ourselves with the thought as the group moved along that the group should find MacPhail had returned. But the group were doomed to disappointment. There were no tidings of him, and sorrowfully did the group set to work to dig poor Horry's grave. After Malcolm had read the service from the English prayer book over him, the group sawed off a pine log, which was inserted a couple of feet deep in the ground, and on the upper part, which had been smoothed for that purpose, the group carved, in rude letters, his name and the date of his death. Days of their time have been spent in strengthening their defenses, and the group have had some severe labor in felling pine trees and dragging them to the stockade. The group have driven sharpened stakes into the earth, and after laying the logs longitudinally within them, have twisted the lighter boughs and brushwood of the trees in the interstices. Before the group began this task, however, the trapper Malcolm and Lacos started in search of MacPhail, but returned the same night, Sunday, unsuccessful. In the meantime, his 2 patients got on favorably, the pure air and temperate living doing more for the wounds than medical skill could effect. On Monday, a council was held as to the propriety of sending another party in search of their missing friend, and after some discussion, the trapper started off alone, taking rations with him to last him 2 or 3 days. On Wednesday, the group set to work again, digging and washing, confining ourselves, however, to that portion of the stream and to those cannons which were in the vicinity of the camp. Upon the whole, they made good progress during the week, frequently averaging 4 ounces of gold dust and flakes a day per man. Early on Wednesday, the trapper made his appearance, but he had returned without any tidings of their missing friend. It was upon Thursday evening, as the group were returning to the camp after a hard day's work, that the group were delighted at perceiving their comrade MacPhail, whom they had given up for lost, making his way towards us, accompanied by a couple of Indians, fantastically dressed in the Spanish fashion, the costumes having been probably purchased by the sale of gold dust lower down the country. Their friend was, of course, joyfully received, and a special can of pisco punch brewed in honor of his return. His adventures since his separation from the party were soon related. He had turned aside to water his horse at a small rivulet, and on his return, waited at the trail for his comrades, whom he conceived to be still in the rear. After waiting for nearly half an hour, he thought that they must have passed him, and galloped after them in what he conceived to be the proper trail. After half an hour's ride, however, he found himself utterly at sea, no sign of the camp or of his comrades. He mounted several high ridges, which he hoped might command a view of the Bear Valley, but all he could see was a wilderness of hills and deep ravines, there and there checkered with fertile bottoms clumped with pines and oaks. In fact, he grew quite confused, and to add to his perplexity, in fording a rapid torrent his horse stumbled, and was carried off his legs by the strength of the stream, and had to swim for it. At length they gained the further bank, but their friend found that in his agitation he had dropped his rifle, which was irrecoverably gone. Finding that he had no knowledge of the country about him, he determined to encamp for the night, and accordingly laid his head on his saddle, wrapped himself up in his cloak, and went supperless to sleep. When he awoke in the morning, he found that his horse, which he had tethered to a neighboring stunted tree, had strayed away, and although he followed his trail for some time, he was eventually obliged to give up the search. The remainder of this and the following day he wandered about at random, amidst a wild and sterile country, furrowed with tremendous chasms several hundred feet in depth, and the edge of which it was necessary to skirt for miles ere a crossing place could be found. During this time, poor MacPhail fared very hardly. He saw numerous herds of elk, but they bounded past unharmed. He had no rifle. He tried in vain to find some edible roots, and was at length reduced to the necessity of chewing grass and the pith of alder trees. Throughout this period, his sufferings were excessive, but as the time passed and brought no relief, he experienced a sickness and nausea of the most gnawing and horrible description. He became so weak that he could hardly stand. At length at sunset, on the third day of his wanderings, he laid himself down upon a spot of grass and fell into a kind of stupor, in the full belief that he would only wake in the agonies of death. It was then that he was discovered by the 2 Indians who brought him to the camp. They behaved with great humanity towards him, allowing him, however, to eat, first of all, only a few morsels of the dried meat which they had with them, that he might not harm himself by overeating after such a lengthened fast. As his stomach by degrees recovered its tone, they permitted him to take further nutriment, and after encamping with them on that and the following night, he felt sufficiently recovered to proceed on his journey to this camp. His kind benefactors understood a few words of Spanish, and he was enabled to explain to them the part of the country he wished to reach. They undertook to guide him thither, told him they would arrive there after having slept once, and by slow marches made their way to Bear Valley, which they reached on the evening of the second day. MacPhail expressed his surprise on finding that he had wandered no greater distance off. He showed his gratitude to his guides by presenting them with the 2 large holster pistols which he brought with him from Oregon, and on the following morning they took their departure from the camp. Excitement the group have lately undergone has unfitted us for regular labor, and besides, one has had altogether a tolerably long spell of toil. Although ever since the group have been fairly settled there, now about a month, the group have not worked more than from 4 to 5 hours daily, and have taken it by turns to go out on hunting expeditions. Still, he thinks most of us have had enough of it. And were it not that the rainy season will soon set in, when the group shall be compelled to give over work, he should, for his own part, feel inclined to return to the coast forthwith. Sickness has begun to show itself in their camp, and the group have 3 men now laid up. Bradshaw, whose wound, though healing, will still confine him for many days. Biggs, who has had a severe attack of fever but is now recovering fast. And Bowling, who lies inside the shanty in an almost helpless state. His stock of drugs, too, is nearly exhausted. Thank God, his own health has altogether been most excellent. Although the vegetation dying off in the valleys at this time of the year gives rise to a sort of malaria still, from the herbage not being of so rank a character about there as it was in the lower settlements, the effects are by no means so injurious. Besides, the cool air from the mountains acts as a wholesome check. Their provisions have run very low. Nearly the whole of their flour is exhausted, and the group are forced to live on the produce of their hunting expeditions. The little flour the group have is set apart for the invalids of the party. The previous day their hunters came in, after being absent all day, with only a black-tailed deer and a couple of hares. Quails, however, are tolerably plentiful. Lacos and the trapper have volunteered to set off to Sutter's, and bring us up a supply of breadstuffs sufficient to last us until the sickly season sets in. He believed it was arranged for them to start off tomorrow. September 1st. There have been several discussions as to the prudence of keeping the large quantity of gold the group have already procured in camp, when the group are liable to be surprised by the Indians, who for the sake of it would tomahawk and scalp us all round. It seems to have spread from tribe to tribe that the yellow earth which the pale faces are in search of will buy not only beads and buttons and red paint, but rifles, and charges of powder and ball, scarlet blankets, and the strong water, which the Indian loves, alas, not wisely but too well. Some are of the opinion that the group ought to keep it by us, always leaving a proper guard on the lookout, until the group finally abandon the digging, when the group could return with it to the settlements in a body. Bradley and Don Lewis are rather opposed to this plan, and volunteer to take the gold themselves to San Francisco or Monterey immediately and deliver it into the custody of some merchant there on their joint account. He don't like this suggestion, for the amount is sufficiently large to tempt anyone to make off with it. Besides, it would be dangerous to send it without a strong guard. That day the group have put ourselves on short rations, as their stock of provisions is getting very low. September 2nd. The camp generally seemed to be in favor of Bradley's proposition. Some of the more timid ones consider that the group shall be in constant danger for the next 2 months before the rainy season commences, when the group must give over work. It was a great pity that the gold was not sent down at the time Lacos and the trapper left. 3 Indians came into the camp last night, belonging, the group believe, to some tribe no great distance off. The group gave them a good supper, and after it was over the group took care to make as much display as possible of their firearms and bullet pouches, and to see that their horses and mules were well tethered before the group turned in for the night. Story and McPhail were the first guard. The 3 Indians wrapped themselves up in their blankets and slept just outside the tent, and after a good breakfast in the morning took their departure, shaking hands with the expedition all round, and expressing by other signs their satisfaction at the treatment they had met with. Biggs is nearly recovered from his attack and will commence work again in a couple of days. Meanwhile, he is doing guard duty. Dowling and Bradshaw are still both very ill. September 3rd, Sunday. Bradley repeated his proposition that day that himself and Don Lewis, accompanied by Jose, who was to take charge of a couple of horses, with packs containing the bulk of the gold, should start off the following morning. Story was of opinion that they ought to be attended by a guard as far as the Sacramento Valley, but to their surprise, Bradley and Don Lewis opposed this suggestion, on the score that such a precaution was unnecessary. The previous day evening, he took an opportunity of speaking privately to Malcolm and McPhail in reference to Bradley's proposition, and also in reference to his and Don Lewis's peremptory dismissal of Story's suggestion, without even allowing it to be discussed. The group then brought a circumstance to their recollection which had never struck us before, namely, that neither of us had ever seen Captain Sutter's receipt for the gold Bradley had deposited in the captain's charge, and the group determined to bring the matter up the first opportunity. That day, therefore, while the group were at breakfast, Malcolm asked Bradley if Captain Sutter had given a receipt for the gold, when he answered yes, certainly, but to their surprise stated that he had had the misfortune to burn it. He went on to say that while on his return to Weber's Creek during a halt he made, he had struck a light for his cigar and had incautiously used the receipt for that purpose. He had mentioned the matter to Don Lewis, he said, the same day he returned. Malcolm, McPhail, and himself looked at each other, but the group felt bound to believe Bradley's statement. The group arranged, however, during a stroll they made from the camp, after breakfast was finished, not to agree to Bradley's proposition in reference to the conveyance of their present stock of gold, unless one of us 3 formed one of the party accompanying it. After dinner, he brought the subject forward by observing that if it was intended Bradley's plan should be carried out, Malcolm would desire to form one of the party. And as an excuse for his going, he stated that he wished him to get him a supply of drugs at San Francisco, as the little stock he had brought with him was quite exhausted, foolish-like, not thinking at the time that Bradley and Don Lewis could have procured them quite as readily as Malcolm, and that Brooks was therefore giving no reason at all for his accompanying them. Malcolm, however, came to his relief by stating he had business at San Francisco, as he wished to see the captains of some of the vessels in the harbor there that might be bound for the Columbia River. Bradley gave Don Lewis a side look and said that no ships bound for the Columbia would be found at San Francisco at this time of the year. Biggs, however, who knew more about the shipping at that port than any of us, observed there would be, and rather a warm discussion ensued, which was interrupted by Story and McPhail both saying to Bradley that as Malcolm really wanted to go to San Francisco, they had better go in company, As there could be no possible objection to this course, it has been finally arranged for them to start off on the 5th, Tuesday. Jose was to be left behind. The takings of the past week have been very good, considering that the group have 2 of the expedition absent and 3 laid up with illness. The sky has been a good deal overcast that day, but still, from what he learned, there is no chance of rain for another month. Agreed on. The group rose before daybreak, breakfasted, and got the horses in readiness just as the sun showed over the mountain. At his suggestion, Malcolm had the strongest horse the group possessed allotted to him, as it had been arranged that he should carry the bulk of the gold, and that Don Lewis and Bradley, who were to take as much as they could carry in their saddlebags, were to form the guard. This plan was adopted in preference to having a led horse, which it was thought would greatly impede their progress and prevent the party from reaching the settlements on the Sacramento that night. Bradley and Don Lewis each took with them 18 pounds weight of gold. Malcolm, who was unencumbered by anything and merely carried a brace of pistols in his belt, took very nearly 70 pounds. To relieve Malcolm's horse as much as possible, 3 of us, who were to act as an escort to within a few miles of the Sacramento Valley, were each to carry 15 pounds weight of the gold so far as the party traveled. This escort was composed of Story, Jose, and himself. The group started off soon after sunrise, amidst the faint cheers of their invalided companions, and as it was necessary for the escorting party to return to the camp that night, it was agreed that the group were to retrace their steps at noon or thereabouts. The commencement of their ride was through an open country, broken up by boulders of granite and clumps of dark gray sage trees, when after ascending some low rocky hills, their summits crowned with a dense forest of gigantic pines, the group entered a grassy valley, lined with groups of noble cedars, whose spreading branches offered a most inviting shade. Every now and then, they had to make their way down the sides of huge chasms which intercepted their progress, and then to toil slowly up the difficult ascent. At noon, the group halted and took shelter from the sun in a little dell with a gushing spring bubbling up in the midst, and a patch of willows fringing the banks of the running stream. The group scampered their horses down it, dismounted, and turning them loose to graze, seated ourselves at the base of a huge rock of granite. Their wallet of provisions was opened, and the group soon made a hearty meal. Just as they had finished, some loose earth and a few small stones came tumbling down from above, knocking every now and then against the projecting ledges of rock in their descent. The group immediately started up, thinking it might be some grisly old bear anxious to make a meal of us, and Bradley and Malcolm scrambled up above to get a shot at him. But he had been too quick for them, for just as they reached the top, they heard the branches of the trees crackling in a tuft of underwood opposite, which lay between us and a deep watercourse they had just crossed. As a fatiguing journey was before them, they did not think it worthwhile to give chase to the brute, and were on the point of descending again into the little hollow where they had left us, when the print of a man's foot caught Bradley's eye in the soft, sandy earth. Several others were noticed close by, none of which, Bradley protested, had been made by the expedition, and certainly not by a bear, but by some skulking Indians who had been very likely hovering about us. They hastened to communicate this intelligence to us, and it was decided that, as the party bound for the coast were now within some few hours' ride of the upper settlements on the Sacramento, no Indians would be daring enough to attack them, and it would hardly be worthwhile for us to accompany them further. The group, however, insisted upon riding a few miles more on the road, which having done, the group took leave of them with many wishes for their safe and speedy return, and turned their horses' heads round in the direction of the camp. Feeling rather fidgety at the incident of the morning, the group passed the spot where it had taken place, keeping an anxious lookout in every direction, and after a hard ride of several hours, reached the camp shortly after sundown, glad that they had escaped any disaster. They had a merry evening of it. A double allowance of whiskey was served out, and the group drank their friend's safe arrival and return. He now sit down for the first time, after a lapse of several weeks, to resume the continuation of his narrative. Late in the evening of the 5th, while his companions were chatting over the fire and Brooks was engaged in writing, the group were interrupted on a sudden by a loud whistle, the note of which he thought he could not be mistaken in. "Sure, that's Bradley," exclaimed he. The others thought not, and catching up their rifles, examined the flints. The whistle, when again repeated, convinced everyone, however, that his first surmise had been correct. In another minute Bradley galloped up to us, and Don Lewis soon followed after, but to their astonishment Malcolm was not of the party. "His friends," exclaimed Bradley, "a sad disaster, the best part of the gold is gone, lost beyond a doubt." "Lost," said he, expecting some treachery on the part of Bradley and Don Lewis. "How? He don't believe it, he never will believe it." Bradley gave him an angry look but said nothing. "Where's Malcolm?" exclaimed he. "Dead by this time, he was afraid," replied Bradley. "Good God!" he exclaimed aloud and involuntarily muttered to himself. "Then you have murdered him." He noticed Bradley examined the countenances of the whole party by turns, and as his eye followed his, he observed that everyone looked sullen and angry. He too evidently saw this and said nothing more the whole evening. Don Lewis, however, volunteered the following explanation of the mystery. He informed us that, after they had parted from them, they put their horses into a quick trot to escape as soon as possible into a more agreeable-looking sort of country. They suspected some vagabond Indians were hovering about, and as the ground they were traveling over afforded too many opportunities of concealment to gentry of their character, they were anxious to reach a more open district. Their road lay, for several miles, over a succession of small hills, intersected by valleys covered with stunted oak trees, and with there and there a solitary pine. Just at a point, when they were winding round a ridge of hills, which they imagined separated them from the Sacramento Valley, having a small skirting of timber on their left hand, he, Don Lewis, being slightly in advance of Bradley and Malcolm, happened to turn his head round, when he saw a horseman stealthily emerging from the thicket, at a point a short distance in their rear. In a very few moments another horseman joined the first, and before Don Lewis could give an alarm, the second rider, who, it seems, was an Indian, had risen in his saddle and had flung out his lasso, which, whizzing through the air true to its aim, descended over Malcolm's head and shoulders. Don Lewis, who saw all this, immediately jumped from his horse, and placing his finger on the trigger of his rifle, fired just as the Indian was galloping away. The ball entered his horse's head, when the beast was brought to a stand, and in a second of time rolled over with its rider beneath it, just as the noose had tightened and Malcolm was being drawn off his horse to the ground. Bradley, who only knew of the danger they were in by hearing the lasso whirl through the air, immediately dismounted and, like Don Lewis, sheltered himself behind his horse while he took aim and fired. His never-failing rifle brought down one of their enemies, a swarthy-looking man in the usual Mexican sombrero, off his horse to the ground. In the twinkling of an eye, they led their horses behind some boulders of granite which afforded them cover, and from behind which they saw 4 men come charging down upon them. But Bradley and Don Lewis, skilled in this kind of warfare, had already stooped down and reloaded. Don Lewis was the first to let fly at the advancing party, but without success. His shot was answered by a discharge of rifles from the enemy, which whistled over his and Bradley's heads. Crack went Bradley's rifle again, and you would have thought, said Don Lewis to us, that the ball had split into 4 pieces and had given each man a tender touch, for they wheeled round their horses in an instant and galloped off, driving Malcolm's horse before them, which the group never saw again. Don Lewis then went on to say that as soon as they saw the coast was clear, they left their cover and sought out Malcolm, who was lying on the ground with the lasso lightly pinioning his arms, and to all appearance dead. On a closer examination, however, they found that he still breathed, and also that he had been severely trampled on by some of the horses of the robbers in their retreat. Bradley pulled out his bowie knife and cut the lasso in a few moments when they tried to raise him up, but found that the injuries he had sustained prevented him from standing. He was, in fact, quite insensible. At that moment, they were alarmed by the sound of voices, and looking round they saw a party of horsemen riding up at full speed from the direction of the Sacramento. They gave themselves up for lost, but to their delight, the newcomers proved to be a party of miners, who, hearing so many rifle reports in such rapid succession, had immediately hastened to the spot. Don Luis supposed that the robbers had seen their approach, and that this, and not the bullet from Bradley's rifle, had been the cause of the scoundrels' precipitate retreat. They found the Indian's horse, to the saddle of which the lasso was attached, quite dead. The Indian himself had managed to crawl off, though doubtless much hurt, as Don Luis saw the horse roll right over him. The body of the robber shot by Bradley was found. Life was quite extinct, the ball having passed through his chest in a transverse direction, evidently penetrating thought. He was recognized by some of the miners natives of the country as one of the disbanded soldiers of the late Californian Army, by name Tomas Maria Carrillo, a man of the very worst character, who had connected himself with a small band of depredators, whose occupation was to lie in wait at convenient spots along the roads in the neighborhood of the sea coast, and from thence to pounce upon and plunder any unfortunate merchant or ranchero that might be passing unprotected that way. The gang had now evidently abandoned the coast to try their fortune in the neighborhood of the mines, and judging from the accounts which one of the miners gave of the number of robberies that had recently taken place about there, their mission had been eminently successful. Their first care, continued Don Luis, was to see to poor Malcolm, and their next object was to go in pursuit of the ruffians. On intimating as much to their new friends, to their surprise they declined to render us any assistance. Their curiosity, which it seems was the only motive that brought them towards us, had been satisfied, and Brooks felt disgusted at the brutality of their conduct when they coolly turned their horses' heads round and left us alone with their dying friend, not deigning further to notice their appeals to them for assistance. No, they must set to work again, digging and washing, and the group might thank ourselves that their coming up had saved their lives. This was the burthen of their reply. In their eager pursuit of gold, they had not a moment to spare for the commonest offices of Christian charity. At length, said Don Luis, in answer to his passionate expostulations, backed by the offer of any reward they might demand, which offer alone gave force to his words, two of them consented to return in about an hour with a litter to convey Malcolm to their camp. The litter they brought was formed of branches of trees tied together and covered thickly over with blankets. On this Malcolm was slowly borne down the hillside until a rude shanty was reached. He was carried inside, and the group were fortunate enough to meet with a kind Californian woman who promised to attend on him while the group returned there for your assistance. In reply to his inquiries, Don Luis said that he thought there were no bones broken, but poor Malcolm was dreadfully bruised, and his flesh in parts much lacerated. He feared, however, that he had experienced some severe internal injuries. As it was utterly impossible for him to have found his way to him that night, he determined to take a short nap and hurry to him the following morning. During Don Luis's recital, he did not for one moment think of the gold which they had lost. All his sympathies were with his poor friend. But at the conclusion of Don Luis's narrative, he observed that but few of his associates participated in his grief. Don Luis was immediately assailed with inquiries rudely addressed to him in reference to the missing gold. In reply, he stated that the group all knew that Malcolm carried in his saddlebags the great bulk of the gold they were conveying to San Francisco, and that, of course, when the robbers drove off the horse, the gold went with it. "It was the doctor you have to thank for that," growled out Bradley. And though he could not see the matter in this light, still he could not help thinking of his own distrustful disposition, which in reality had been the cause of making Malcolm a party to the conveyance of the treasure. This, in fact, had in all probability sacrificed his companion's life. He thought of his poor wife and children in Oregon, who would be wailing in vain for his return, which he, poor fellow, had delayed so long, in the hope of going back to them laden with wealth. Throughout the whole of the night, most of the party remained gathered around the campfire, now in sullen silence, and now expressing their bitter dissatisfaction at the arrangements which had led to the day's misfortune. And when the first faint light of daybreak showed over the tall peaks of the snowy mountains, it discovered us looking haggard and dejected, alike wearied and disgusted with everything around. The 6th, and directly it was over, just as Brooks was about saddling his horse to start off to visit poor Malcolm, Don Lewis informed him that their companions seemed all to be of opinion that it would be best to share the stock of gold still remaining at once, when those that preferred it could make their way to the settlements, and the others could continue working, if they pleased, on their own account. He had no objection to offer to this proposition, and the gold was all collected together and weighed. Bradley undertook the charge of Lacoste's share, and Brooks was requested to convey Malcolm's to him. Altogether, the group scraped up nearly 42 pounds weight, for besides the gold which Don Lewis and Bradley had in their saddlebags, there were a few pounds more belonging to the general stock. This had to be divided equally, for the gold they had brought from Weber's Creek had been confided to Malcolm's charge in a separate bag. It gave exactly 4 pounds 2 ounces a man, value $700. This, with $650, his share of the gold deposited with Captain Sutter, and the dust, scales, and lumps arising from his share of the sale of the cradles and the produce at the Mormon Diggings before Lacoste and Biggs joined us, would amount in the whole to over $1,500. The greater part of the morning was taken up with squabbles respecting the weighing of the gold. He took no part in it and was content to receive just what was allotted to him. He called MacPhail aside and asked him what it was he intended doing. He replied that if any of the others would join him, he would start in pursuit of the men who had plundered us. He was sorry the old trapper was not there, as with his assistance, he felt certain the scoundrels might be ferreted out. Feeling that the journey to poor Malcolm was too dangerous a one to be attempted alone, Brooks was compelled to wait until he could prevail on some of the party to join him. Don Lewis, Jose, Bradley, MacPhail, and himself at length arranged to start off. Biggs, who was now quite well, preferred waiting behind a few days longer. Neither Bradshaw nor Bowling were sufficiently recovered to travel. Story determined to wait until they were well enough to accompany him. He hardly liked the notion of leaving these 4 men behind, only 2, or at most 3, of them able to protect themselves in the event of their being attacked. Still, they did not seem to fear the danger, though even if they had, most of us had grown so selfish and unaccommodating that he don't think they would have met with much sympathy. It was an hour beyond noon when the group were in readiness to start. The group took 2 of the baggage horses with us to carry the tent poles and covering and a few utensils. Their personal baggage was packed on the horses the group rode. Bradley and Don Lewis rode in advance. Jose followed with the baggage horses, and MacPhail and himself brought up the rear. They had not proceeded more than 4 miles on the trail when they witnessed a couple of horsemen some distance ahead, advancing towards us. As soon as the group were within a couple of 100 yards of each other, the group at once recognized them to be Lacoste and the old trapper. Urging their horses into a smart trot, the group soon arrived alongside of them, and on inquiring what it was that had caused them to remain so long at Sutter's, and also how it was that they had neither the baggage horses nor, apparently, any provisions with them, Lacoste gave us this explanation. He stated that after leaving the camp, they struck the Sacramento River that night and succeeded in reaching the upper settlements towards evening on the following day. The next morning they pursued their journey and arrived at Sutter's Fort about sundown. They encamped near there for the night. Flour was as much as $85 a barrel, and everything in the way of provisions was in the same proportion. They purchased a stock of flour and, packing their horses, moved off the same day. In the evening they encamped some 15 miles up the Sacramento, near the mouth of the Feather River, and within 100 yards of the spot where the Indian village existed which Captain Sutter had destroyed. the whole circumstances connected with which they had already heard from the old trapper. They resumed the journey early on the following morning, and by the evening had made about 25 miles, when they rested for the night near one of the little camps of miners, which they found scattered about the valley every few miles along the route. The next day they pushed forward, and found those encampments much less numerous. Only one or two were passed throughout the entire day. Just after sundown, however, they saw by the fires up the hills quite a little colony of gold washers, which they moved towards, and after purchasing some provisions at a store recently opened there, for which they paid a most exorbitant price, they securely tethered their horses to stakes they had driven in the ground and encamped for the night. They did not think it necessary to keep watch, but when they awoke in the morning, they found the baggage horses had been driven off and their packs stolen. The horses they had been riding on were just as they had left them overnight. The trail marks around the camp were too numerous to make anything out of them. On making inquiries at several of the tents, they were treated in a very cavalier sort of manner. No one, of course, knew anything about their horses and packs, and one big bony American even threatened to put a rifle ball into them unless they left his shanty. This was rather too much for them to swallow quietly, so they rated the fellow in round terms. But he very coolly reached his rifle down from a shelf above him, and told them that he would give them time to consider whether they would move off or not while he examined his flint, and if they were not gone by that time, he would make a hole in each of their skulls, one after the other. Finding that he was coolly preparing to carry out his threat, they made their exit and found some 10 or 12 people gathered together outside. From one of them, Lacos learnt that this man had shot 2 people since he had fixed himself at this spot, and that he was a terror to most of the miners in the camp. It appears to have been no uncommon thing among them for a man to settle a quarrel by severely disabling his adversary. There were several people at work down by the river, with their arms in slings, who had received serious injuries in quarrels with some of their fellows. They thought it best to escape from such a state of things with as little delay as possible, and immediately mounted their horses and pursued their journey. That night, they took good care to encamp far enough off from any of the gold-finding fraternity. It was now their turn to explain to Lacos the reason of their return to the settlements and the unfortunate circumstances that had led to it. Ho was disappointed enough at the intelligence. He said that he should go on to the fort and collect his baggage together, and would, if possible, join Don Lewis, Bradley, and McPhail at Sutter's, and see whether any plan could be arranged on for recovering their stolen treasure. The trapper was to accompany him, and it was agreed that either Bradley or McPhail should await their arrival at Sutter's fort. The group resumed their journey, and at sundown fixed their tent at the bottom of a steep hollow, and supped off the moderate rations they had brought with us from the camp. The night was quite frosty, and when he awoke in the morning, his limbs were numbed with cold. The group prepared their coffee and partook of their slight breakfast, then, saddling the horses, resumed their march. It was late in the evening when the group reached the rude shanty to which poor Malcolm had been conveyed a couple of days since. It was an anxious moment to him, but Brooks was gratified to find that he had so far recovered from the injuries he had sustained as to be able to sit up and to take some little nourishment. He told him that beyond the severe bruises with which his body was covered, and a wound in the fleshy part of his leg, he did not think he was otherwise injured. Throughout the whole of the previous day, he had experienced the most violent pains in his head, but a comfortable sleep into which he had fallen last night had, to all appearances, entirely deprived him of them. He was troubled, though, he told him, with a sickening sensation which made him loathe anything in the shape of food. He at once prescribed such remedies as he thought necessary to be applied immediately, and left him in charge of his kind nurse until the morning. Brooks was at his bedside shortly after the sun rose, and watched by him until he awoke. Another good night's rest had greatly benefited him. During the day, recurring to his misfortune, he told him that when the lasso first fell over his shoulders, He fancied for the moment that he was in the gripe of some wild beast, but immediately he felt himself drawn from his horse. The truth became apparent to him. He was stunned by the fall and lay insensible on the ground, quite unconscious that the horse of one of the robbers had trampled upon him, as had evidently been the case. Don Lewis, Bradley, MacPhail and Jose left us about noon on their way to Sutter's fort. He promised to rejoin them in a few days, if Malcolm so far recovered as no longer to be in need of his services. Brooks was in great hopes of such a result, as he showed evident signs of improvement since he observed him the previous day. He stayed with Malcolm throughout the next few days, and spent a good part of his time out of doors among the gold washers, but still, Brooks felt no inclination to take part in their labors. Fever was very prevalent, and he found that more than 2/3 of the people at this settlement were unable to move out of their tents. The other third were too selfish to render them any assistance. The rainy season was close at hand, when they would have to give over work, but meanwhile they sought after the gold as though all their hopes of salvation rested on their success. Brooks was told that deaths were continually taking place, and that the living comrades of those whose eyes were closed in that last sleep when the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest, denied the poor corpses of their former friends a few feet of earth for a grave, and left the bodies exposed for the wolf to prey upon. In a couple of days, Malcolm was sufficiently recovered no longer to require his assistance. At his instigation, he took his departure towards Sutter's fort, where MacPhail or Lacos might perhaps still be waiting for him. Brooks felt that he was in good hands, and that his kind Californian nurse and her husband would do all that they could for him. Their kind treatment of his poor friend offered a striking contrast to the callous selfishness around. He journeyed by slow marches along the banks of the Sacramento, passing several colonies of gold finders on his way. At noon, he halted at one of these, and loitered some little time round about the camp. The rapidly decaying vegetation, their unusually rank, was producing a malaria, and sickness was doing its ravages. But still, the poor infatuated people, or rather such of them as were not prevented by positive inability, worked on until they sunk under the toil. Everyone seemed determined to labor as hard as possible for the few weeks left before the rainy season set in, and the result was that many of them met their deaths. There were others, though, who sought to enrich themselves with the shining gold by a quicker, and perhaps less dangerous process than all this weary toil. According to the accounts heard, life and property were alike insecure. The report ran that as soon as it became known that a man had amassed a large amount of gold, he was watched and followed about till an opportunity presented itself of quietly putting him out of the way. There had been but few known deaths, but the number of persons who had been missed, and whose own friends even had not thought it worthwhile to go in search of them, was very large. In every case, the man's stock of gold was not to be found in his tent. Still, there was nothing surprising in this, as everyone made a point of carrying his gold about him, no matter how heavy it might happen to be. 1 or 2 dead bodies had been found floating in the river, which circumstance was looked upon as indicative of foul play having taken place, as it was considered that the poorest of the gold finders carried fully a sufficient weight of gold about them to cause their bodies to sink to the bottom of the stream. Open attempts at robbery were rare. It was in the stealthy night time that thieves prowled about, and, entering the little tents, occupied by not more than perhaps a couple of miners, neither of whom, in all probability, felt inclined to keep a weary watch over their golden treasure, carried off as much of it as they could lay their hands on. By way of precaution, however, almost everyone slept with their bag of gold underneath their pillow, having a rifle or revolver within their reach. That same night he reached the camp of gold washers, where Lacos and the trapper had had their horses and packs of provisions stolen from them. The robbery, he believed, was committed by men almost on the verge of want, who thought it a more convenient way of possessing themselves of a stock of provisions than performing a journey to the lower settlements for that purpose would have been, and a cheaper way than purchasing them there, where they run scarce, and where the price of them is exorbitantly high. Other things are in proportion. Clothing of any description is hardly to be had at any price, and the majority of the miners go about in rags, collected round a rude shanty where brandy was being dispensed at $1 a dram. He observed a group of ragged gold diggers, the greater part of them suffering from fever, paying this exorbitant price for glass after glass of the fiery spirit, every drop of which they consumed was only aggravating their illness, and in all probability, bringing them one step nearer to their grave. The big bony American, who treated Lacos and the trapper in such a peremptory manner, and who seemed to be the terror of these diggings, was pointed out to him. He learned, however, that he had accumulated a very large amount of gold, over $16,000 worth, it was said, and his suspicions that parties were lying in wait to plunder him of it was the cause of his acting as he had done. He thought they only came to his shanty with an excuse, for the purpose of observing its weak points, and that no doubt they had a scheme in their heads for robbing him, either at night time, or while he was absent digging and washing during the day. The men he had shot, it seems, were common thieves, one, a deserter from the garrison at Monterey, and the other belonging to a similar band of robbers to that by which the expedition had been attacked, and their gold carried off. He reached Sutter's fort the next day, and found it like the most crowded localities of some of their great cities, with the exception that the bulk of the people the group met with belonged to a totally different race. He observed Captain Sutter for a few moments, when he informed him that Mr. Bradley and his party had left a couple of days ago, and that a gentleman, accompanied by a man named Joe White, who, as the captain said, used to trap for him before the gold fever came up, had been making inquiries at the fort respecting Mr. Bradley that very day. He at once saw that this could be no other than Lacos, and set off to see if he could meet with him. After some search, Brooks was fortunate enough to discover him at the newly opened hotel there, where he had intended stopping for the night. He remained with him and shared his room, a little box not more than 10 feet by 12 or thereabouts, but the group considered ourselves fortunate in having obtained even that, the place being tremendously crowded. Heard from Lacos that Captain Sutter had informed him that the leader of the band of desperadoes who had plundered us had been seen down at the fort with some of his companions not more than 10 days ago. He was quite sure he was right in the man, for Tomas Maria, who had been shot, belonged to his gang, and was, in fact, his chief lieutenant. The name of El Capitan was Andreas Armjo, and Captain Sutter said he recommended Bradley to make his way to San Francisco, where, in all probability, he would meet with him, as when he left the fort he had taken the road towards the coast. The next day the group started off towards San Francisco, and from inquiries made on the road, found that the group were on the correct track, Bradley, Don Luis, MacPhail, and Jose having passed through a day or two previous. The group arrived at the end of their journey without meeting with any adventures worth noting, and at once made their way to Sweeting's Hotel, glad to find it one of the few houses in this town that were not shut up. There the group met with their friends, who had been there now nearly 2 days, and were then on the point of starting off in pursuit of Andreas and his comrades. The group learned from them that directly they heard the important information which Captain Sutter had communicated to them, they started off in pursuit, but not with any expectation of coming up with the gentleman they were in search of before arriving at San Francisco. They had constant tidings of them all along the route, as El Capitan was too well known to many a poor ranchero whom he had plundered of the dollars produced by the sale of his hides, while on his journey home from the seacoast. When they arrived at San Francisco, they made inquiries whether any ships had recently left the harbor, and were glad to find that there was not a merchant vessel in port with enough hands on board to weigh the anchor. Every ship had been more or less deserted by its crews, who had hastened off for a few weeks' labor at the gold diggings. They found, however, that Andreas Armjo and his men had been making inquiries on board of several of the vessels to ascertain when any of them left port. On finding none were sufficiently manned to do so, They offered the captain of one schooner $1,000 to land them at any port in Mexico he pleased, and said they would themselves help to work the ship. The captain, however, declined the offer. After receiving this intelligence, they went to the house of the first alcalde to consult with him on what steps should be taken to arrest the robbers, who were then doubtless at some place near the coast. They found, however, that he had gone to the mines with the rest of the people, and they made their way to the residence of the second alcalde in the hope of being more fortunate, but he too had gone to the mines with his superior. Further inquiries satisfied them that there was not an officer of justice left in the town of San Francisco, and they had therefore determined to make their way forthwith to Monterey, as in all probability the gang would proceed there in the hope of meeting with a ship. Lackasen himself determined to accompany them, and the old trapper volunteered his services, which were accepted. The group obtained fresh horses from Sweden and set off in gallant style, determined to shorten the distance by hard riding. It was early on Wednesday morning when the group arrived at Monterey, and MacPhail and Bradley proceeded to board all the ships in the bay, while Don Lewis, Lackasen, and himself made inquiries about the town. The group soon learnt that Andreas Armjo and his party had been paying it a visit, and moreover, one of the gang, who thought he had disguised himself so as not to be recognized, had been seized as a deserter from the garrison there. The others were not interfered with, as there was no specific charge out against them. Their robbery had, of course, not been heard of there. Don Lewis and himself, after having dispatched Lackasen to communicate this intelligence to Bradley and MacPhail, sought an interview with Colonel Mason, and on informing him of the robbery and the circumstances attending it, received from him an order to see the soldier who was then under arrest. By promises of not proceeding against him, for any share he might have had in the robbery, the group induced him to confess the whole circumstances connected with it, and also to inform us of the route intended to be taken by El Capitan and the two others of the gang. This, it seems, was along the Great Spanish Trail to Santa Fe. On rejoining their companions, the group decided to continue there the remainder of the day and to start off the next morning in pursuit. The group informed Colonel Mason of the circumstance, and he stated that he would have furnished us with a guard to accompany us if he did not feel certain that the men would desert to the mines directly they got outside the town. At 4 o'clock the next morning, the group commenced the journey, each of us taking a stock of provisions sufficient to last for a fortnight, although the group hoped and fully expected that the group should be back to Monterey several days before that time had expired. It was purely a question of hard riding. Andreas and his party had started, as far as the group could learn, 3 days in advance of us, and no doubt knew the track better than the old trapper who had undertaken to accompany us as guide. He had never penetrated further than the foot of the Sierra, so that if the group were compelled to cross the mountains, the group should have to seek for some Indians to guide us on their course. By pressing their horses hard, the group succeeded in crossing the hills of the coast range that night, and encamped some slight way down the descent, in as sheltered a spot as the group could manage to select. The night was quite frosty, but they made up a blazing fire and, well wrapped up in their serapes, slept till morning, without feeling much inconvenience from the cold. Next day the group struck the river of the lakes, and found it thickly hemmed in with timber along its whole course. The group soon found a fording place, and encamped at night a few miles from the east bank. The following morning the group fell in with some civilized Indians, who informed us, in answer to their inquiries, that a party of 3 whites passed along the trail the evening before last, and that they would have encamped not far from this spot. These Indians, Don Lewis informed him, had all of them been attached to the Californian missions, but since the downfall of these establishments, they had moved across the coast range, and had located themselves in the neighborhood of the Tule Lakes, subsisting chiefly on horseflesh. To gratify their appetites, however, instead of giving chase to the number of wild horses, they're called mustangs, that are scattered over the extensive prairies in the neighborhood of the lakes, they adopt a much lazier method of supplying their larder. This is to make predatory excursions across the mountains and to drive off a large herd of tame horses belonging to some poor ranchero at a time. These they slaughter and subsist on as long as the flesh lasts, when they set out again on a similar expedition. Sometimes they are pursued and, if overtaken, butchered forthwith, but in general they manage to escape some little distance into the interior, where they are safe not to be followed. The group put spurs into their horses, and soon cleared the marshy ground intervening between us and the fork, which the group forded, and rode for several miles through a country thickly covered over with oak trees and intersected by numerous small rivulets. Large herds of elk were frequently started, and during the whole day their shrill whistle was continually being heard. The group encamped tonight without having heard anything more of Andreas Armjo and his companions. Several parties of Indians the group met a few hours before sundown stated that they had not seen any white men along the trail. Brooks felt disposed, as far as Brooks was himself concerned, to give over the pursuit, as his horse was already worn out by the journey, but his companions would not listen to it, and determined, at any rate, to see what would result from following it up briskly during the next day. They had all noticed that there were no new signs of horses that had been shod passing along the trail, but Bradley was of opinion that the party would be mounted on unshod beasts, as very few of the native Californians had their horses shod, unless they were going a journey across a rough, broken country. Next day the group fell in with several more parties of Indians, from whom the group learnt that the men the group were in pursuit of were full 2 days' journey before us. One party, who had seen them encamp the preceding evening more than 40 miles ahead, told us that they had inquired of them where the trail turned off to Los Angelos. As this town was at least 5 or 6 days' journey distant, and as the Sierra had to be crossed to reach it, the group concluded among ourselves that it would be best for us to return to Monterey forthwith. This decision was readily come to, as there was now no hope of overtaking the party, and every step the group preceded the group were getting into a more hostile country. In all probability, if they had pursued them to Los Angelos, the group should have discovered that they had struck off on to the Great Spanish Trail, as was their original intention, or else have found that they had been to Los Angelos and had taken their departure for some other place. The group therefore turned their horses' heads and retraced their steps towards the coast in no merry mood. The group rode along, in fact, in sullen silence, only broken to mutter out their expressions of disappointment at the escape of those who had robbed us of the fruits of so many months of toil, exposure, and hardship. The group encountered nothing very remarkable during their 3 days' journey to Monterey. There were the same prairies to cross, the same thickets to penetrate, and the same streams to ford. Herds of elk and mustangs were continually seen upon thights, and every now and then the group met with some small parties of Indians, many of the chiefs dressed in the Spanish fashion. The group were too well armed and too many in number for any of them to venture to attack us, had they been so inclined, but generally their intentions seemed to be perfectly pacific. They had previously determined on arriving at the seacoast to part company. There was now no object for keeping together in a party, and their future plans were, of course, very undecided. It was, therefore, clearly advisable that the group should, at least for the present, separate. This resolution was not come to without something like a pang which he sincerely felt, and which he believed was more or less experienced by us all. They had lived for 4 months in constant companionship. They had undergone hardships and dangers together, and a friendship, more vivid than can well be imagined in civilized lands to have been the growth of so short a period, had sprung up betwixt us. There had been a few petty bickerings between us, and some unjust suspicions on his part in respect to Bradley, but these were all forgotten. Common sense, however, dictated the dissolution of the expedition. When the group reached Monterey, the party traveled to an inferior sort of hotel, but the best open, and the following day the group arranged the division of the proceeds arising from the sale of the gold that Bradley had left with Captain Sutter for consignment there. The same night they had a supper, at which a melancholy species of joviality was in the ascendant, and the next day shook hands and parted. Don Luis went back to his own pleasant home, and Bradley started for San Francisco. As for the others, he hardly knew what were their destinations. All he knew is that on waking the next morning he found that Brooks was alone. After breakfast he walked about the town. Like San Francisco, Monterey has been nearly deserted. Everybody has gone to the diggings, leaving business, ships, and stores to take care of themselves. The persons who remain are either persons carrying on profitable branches of commerce, the very existence of which requires the presence of principals upon the spot, and their clerks and servants, who have been tempted by high wages to stay. To give an idea of the rate of remuneration paid, he may mention that salesmen and shopmen have been receiving at the rate of from $2,300 to $2,700 with their board per annum. Mere boys get extravagant salaries in the absence of their seniors, and the lowest and most menial offices are paid for at a rate which only such a wonderful influx of gold would render credible. But even with the inducement of this high pay, it was found exceedingly difficult to retain the services of persons engaged in commercial and domestic capacities. He learned from Colonel Mason that the officers in garrison at Monterey had not been able for 2 months to command the assistance of a servant. Indeed, they had been actually obliged either to cook their own dinners or to go without. Everyone had taken his turn in the culinary department, and even Colonel Mason had not been exempted. The prevalence of sickness at the mines has sent a few people back there, but with the commencement of the rainy season, he anticipates that there will be plenty of labor in the market, and that its value will become correspondingly depreciated. In the meantime, the general aspect of the town is forlorn and deserted. Stores are shut, houses blocked up, and in the harbor ships ride solitary and defenseless.